Hello everyone. I am your storyteller, and when you are in a quiet moment, I want you to imagine something. A place where silence is not just emptiness but something breathing, something watching. If you are listening to this video at night, let the darkness come closer, but make sure you feel comfortable. Please like, share with everyone and subscribe to the channel. It is the most precious gift. It motivates me to continue telling stories. And leave a comment to let me know where you will join me from tonight. It's a cold, mechanical silence that fills the empty corridors of Carson Financial. It's a silence that carries whispers, whispers of the servers humming, the elevator shaft groaning under the weight of a building that has lived far longer than anyone remembers. And after months of working late hours, I had come to know the rhythm of this silence like the back of my hand. Every hum, every click, every subtle creak, they spoke to me, like a secret language. But one night, the silence began to shift. And I heard something that didn't belong. At 2:17 a.m., the silence was shattered. A tap, tap, tap echoed down the hallway outside my office. It was soft, rhythmic, almost methodical. My initial thought: it's the custodian. But I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him working at this hour. It seemed strange, but I brushed it off. I had a mountain of work to finish. The Miller portfolio deadline loomed like a guillotine over my head. But at 2:24 a.m., the footsteps came again, this time louder. Tap 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 tap. 5 steps, in perfect cadence. I froze, my fingers suspended over the keyboard. Something about those steps felt off. No human walks like that. It wasn't the sound, it was the rhythm. It was too precise, too deliberate. Every step landed with perfect symmetry, as though someone was walking in a pattern that was far too calculated to be human. I returned to my spreadsheets, trying to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to the footsteps. The Fibonacci sequence I was working on, suddenly, it twisted into the pattern of those steps. 3, 5, 8. Why? What was happening? It was all too perfect, too unsettling. At exactly 2:33 a.m., the footsteps returned. Tap 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 tap. 8 steps. My skin tightened, my heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen in disbelief. 3, 5, 8, there it was again, the Fibonacci sequence. What could this mean? The numbers, the steps, they were aligning, forming a rhythm that couldn't just be coincidence. I stood up, my legs stiff, unsure of what to do. The rational part of me screamed to open the door, check the hallway, see the source of the sound. But something inside me, the primal instinct to avoid danger, told me to stay where I was. I glanced through the narrow window in the door, peering into the empty hallway, expecting to see something, anything. But the hallway remained motionless, eerily empty under the dim emergency lighting. I felt the pressure of the silence settle back over me, but it was different now, thick, heavy, as if something was waiting. I returned to my desk, my mind still reeling. I opened a new spreadsheet, this time titled Sounds, and began recording every single detail. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I would understand what was happening. I had to. 2:44 a.m. Tap 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 tap. 13 steps. The numbers filled the spreadsheet, but they didn't bring comfort. They only deepened the mystery. The intervals between the steps were changing, 2, 7 minutes, then 9 minutes, then 11. The times were stretching out, becoming more irregular, yet they followed a strange, undeniable pattern. I could feel my throat tighten as I stared at the screen. If this pattern held, the next set of footsteps would come at 2:57 a.m., and there would be 21 steps. My heart raced. This had to be the result of some sort of sleep deprivation, right? No. Something deeper, darker, was at work here. The clock crawled to 2:57 a.m., each second dragging like molasses. I gripped the edge of my desk, listening to the silence, my mind whispering over the numbers. At exactly 2:57, it happened. Tap tap tap, exactly 21 steps. My breath caught in my throat, a cold sweat forming across my forehead. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the way they came, the way they followed the pattern with exact precision. I documented everything, noting the time between steps, the sound of each footfall, the direction of movement, always from east to west. Never returning. A wave of dread washed over me as I realized I wasn't alone in that building. And whoever, or whatever, was out there was following a pattern I couldn't explain. I was trapped in this pattern, just like the footsteps that came at set intervals. Each tap echoed louder in my mind. Every footfall was a ticking clock, counting down to something I couldn't predict, something I couldn't understand. As I documented the 21 steps, I felt a pulse of fear rising in my chest. What if I was being watched? What if the pattern wasn't just footsteps, it was a message, a warning? The thought gnawed at me. The lights flickered above me, a harsh reminder of the world outside. But here, in this quiet office, the silence was becoming suffocating. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a stage, and I was part of the show, whether I wanted to be or not. I didn't leave. I couldn't. Something told me I needed to stay, to understand, to uncover the mystery behind the steps. But as I sat there, watching the minutes slip away, I realized something. The pattern had a purpose, and it wasn't over yet. There was something else out there. Something waiting in the shadows of the hallway. And soon, I would discover just how deep this rabbit hole really went. I even recorded the sounds on my phone, though when I played it back, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was terribly wrong with the recording. The footsteps didn't sound like they were coming from within the building at all. Instead, they seemed distant, faint, like they were echoing through some dimension adjacent to our reality. The hollow resonance sent chills down my spine. By 4:30 a.m., I had logged 7 sequences of these footsteps. Each sequence followed the Fibonacci progression flawlessly, and the intervals between them had started to stretch by exactly 2 minutes each time. By the time I recorded the 7th, the number of steps had reached 233. I calculated that the next sequence would have 377 steps, taking nearly 5 minutes to complete. But something was off, something deeper than just numbers. As a financial analyst, I had a sharp eye for patterns, and these weren't random, they were organized, mathematical, and almost deliberate. Beneath the surface, I began to recognize something else. This wasn't just a series of random steps. These were more like messages, communication in the form of a cryptic mathematical language. The intervals between individual steps within each sequence, when mapped out, formed a three-dimensional matrix, an intricate web of data points. By 5 a.m., I had created an algorithm to visualize these points. At first, the results seemed like gibberish, a collection of floating dots, scattered aimlessly in space. But then I connected them, and as the points linked together, my heart skipped a beat. The pattern on my screen, once a random blur, now looked like a tunnel, or some kind of corridor, stretching outwards from a single point. It widened as the sequences progressed, like a vortex growing larger with every new footstep. It was only at 5:13 a.m. that I had the realization that took my breath away. The corridor on my screen was not some abstract shape, it aligned perfectly with the hallway outside my office. This wasn't just a pattern, it was something mapping our very space, our physical reality, from somewhere else. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My mind couldn't process it. My coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor, the sound piercing the silence in the most grotesque way. The impact of the crash broke my trance, and I suddenly became aware of my body. Sweat clung to my back, my breath was shallow, and my hands shook with tremors I couldn't control. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my coat, my laptop, and made a move for the door. But just as I reached for my phone to call for help, the first step of the 8th sequence fell. Tap. My heart raced. I froze. The mechanical rhythm of the footsteps was unmistakable, unnervingly precise. Tap. 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 With every footfall, the sound seemed to draw closer, but that was impossible. The hallway outside my office couldn't have changed. It was too short, too confined to accommodate 377 continuous steps. But then the impossible thought struck me like a lightning bolt. What if the hallway itself was changing? My blood ran cold. I abandoned my phone and rushed to the door. Peering through the narrow window, I could see that the hallway was no longer the same. It wasn't just empty. It stretched, farther than it should have, as though the walls themselves were warping and bending. The emergency lights flickered and faded into a vanishing point that had no right existing on the 34th floor of this building. I stumbled backward, colliding with my desk. My mind screamed, this couldn't be real. I was hallucinating from exhaustion, or maybe I'd fallen asleep at my desk and was trapped in some fevered nightmare. I pinched my arm so hard I left a mark, but the hallway remained, impossibly stretching before my eyes. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept going. Tap, 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 each one pulling the corridor further out of shape. It stretched, warped, twisted, like taffy being pulled between dimensions. The hallway, the steps, they didn't belong in this world. And then, in a flicker of darkness, I saw it. A shape at the far end of the hallway, not quite a figure, not quite a person, just a mass, shifting, incomprehensible. It didn't fit into three-dimensional space the way it should have. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the door with a thud. My phone, shaking in my hands, finally connected to security. The night guard's voice came through, thick with boredom. When I asked if he saw anything strange, any distortion in the hallway, he responded with confusion. "The corridor's fine," he said. "Nothing out of the ordinary. You must be tired." I knew I was not hallucinating. Something, someone, was outside my door, mapping the space in ways I couldn't understand. But the worst part? He couldn't see it. No one could. The hallway was changing. And it was pulling me into something I was not prepared for. As I waited, my eyes drifted back to the computer screen. The three-dimensional model had transformed again. The corridor now stretched far beyond the building's physical limits, its lines extending into an impossible distance. But there was something else. A new shape had emerged in the model, something moving through the corridor, from its furthest end, advancing with every sequence of footsteps. The shape was like nothing I had seen before. It couldn't be classified, couldn't be understood through the usual three-dimensional framework. My software, limited by its own dimensions, rendered it only as a distorted shadow. A series of intersecting planes, angles folding in on themselves in ways that made my eyes ache. The more I looked, the more the shape seemed to defy logic, as if it wasn't fully bound by the laws of our reality. But one thing became painfully clear, it was coming closer. In that moment, I started to grasp what was really happening. The footsteps weren't merely tracking or mapping our physical world, they were tearing at its fabric. Every perfectly timed step was weakening the boundary between dimensions, creating a rift. The steps weren't just sound, they were a doorway. The Fibonacci sequence, this unexplainable pattern, was a mathematical key, turning in the lock to something far darker, far older, and far more alien than anything I could comprehend. By now, the security guard still hadn't arrived. I tried calling again, my heart racing, but the phone just rang, endlessly. No answer. I was alone, locked in this building, with the footsteps echoing and a growing, undeniable certainty that something ancient and utterly alien was making its way toward me from another reality. I had two choices. Run through the hallways, now distorted and shifting, or remain in place, trapped with whatever was coming. Neither option seemed survivable. But as I stared at the computer screen, something else occurred to me. If the footsteps were what created this breach, if they were the catalyst for this dimensional rift, then perhaps disrupting the pattern could close it. The footsteps had now surpassed 300, well on their way to 377. The numbers told me I had precious little time. I grabbed my phone, trembling as I accessed a sound engineering app I'd used for presentations in the past. Desperation and panic were clouding my thoughts, but I needed to act fast. I isolated the exact acoustic signature of the footsteps from my recording and inverted the waveform, creating a counter wave, a cancellation pattern. But this wasn't enough. The footsteps weren't merely sound, they were mathematical constructs, manifesting as physical sound. I needed something more, something physical. My eyes landed on the office fire alarm. The building's alarm system operated on a precisely timed pulse, regular bursts of sound, timed at 0.5-second intervals. If I could time it right, just perfectly, it could disrupt the footsteps' 0.78-second intervals, create an interference pattern that would collapse the sequence. The tension in the air felt thick as I watched the screen, the footsteps counting down. When the 321st step fell, I grabbed the fire alarm handle. My hand was slick with sweat, but I pulled with every ounce of strength in my body. The shriek of the alarm tore through the building, shattering the rhythm of the footsteps with a sound that felt like it could split reality itself. Through the narrow window in my door, I saw the corridor in the model vibrate, its impossible length contracting. It was as if the very space was in pain, shrinking back, folding inward. Something at the far end, something I couldn't even begin to understand, seemed to writhe, struggling against the disturbance. The pulse of the fire alarm matched the steps, creating nodes of destructive interference. I pressed my face against the door window, watching as the hallway outside snapped back to normal with such force that the entire building seemed to tremble beneath my feet. The emergency lights flickered violently, then stabilized, casting their cold glow down the now unremarkable corridor. The elevator bank was once again in its proper place. The footsteps had ceased. In their place, the building was filled with the confused murmur of voices, the clattering of doors opening as my colleagues, those few night workers still present, reacted to the fire alarm. Someone shouted about evacuation protocols. But none of that mattered to me now. I had just survived something that shouldn't have been possible. The night security guard appeared at the end of the hallway. He looked at me, annoyance and confusion in his eyes. He was fully corporeal, solid, completely unaware of the terror that had just unfolded. I sank to the floor, my back pressing against the door, breathing heavily. My lungs burned with breaths I hadn't even realized I was holding. My laptop chimed with a system error, and when I looked at the screen, the modeling program had crashed. All the dimensional calculations, everything, was gone. The breach had closed, leaving no trace behind. But I knew better. The breach had only closed temporarily. What had just happened, what I had experienced, was not over. It was only just beginning. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had crossed that threshold, whatever had been waiting on the other side, would return. As the evacuation proceeded, I quickly saved the original spreadsheet with its meticulous record of step counts and intervals. The evidence. The one thing that could serve as proof of the madness I had experienced, proof for myself if no one else would believe me. I sent the file to a secure cloud folder, knowing that I would need it someday. The evacuation lasted nearly an hour. Fire services came, checked the building, and found no sign of fire or hazard. Management sent everyone home for the day, with promises to investigate the fire alarm trigger. I joined the sea of disgruntled employees heading to the parking garage, my laptop clutched tightly against my chest. I hadn't been this close to anything in my entire life, and I had no intention of returning to the office. I called in sick the next day. Then I used up my vacation days. By the time I submitted my resignation, I had no choice but to sever all ties. The Miller portfolio, the project I had poured so much of myself into, remained unfinished. My career in financial analysis was over. Now, I spend my days in a small apartment, far removed from the downtown office, far from everything I once knew. But my obsession is not over. I can't forget the patterns I uncovered. The data I salvaged is incomplete. Whatever came through that night didn't make it through, but it's not over. The breach was sealed, but only temporarily. The mathematics in the pattern, each Fibonacci step, suggests it will try again, somewhere else. Maybe it's already begun. At night, sometimes, I think I hear it. Footsteps. Distant, faint, but unmistakable. They follow no pattern I can discern, no Fibonacci progression. Just random, wandering footfalls, likely the comings and goings of my neighbors. Or maybe that's what I want to believe. I've installed sound monitoring equipment in my apartment, set to alert me if it detects any repeating intervals, any consistent patterns that might be trying to break through again. I've tried to reach out, contacting mathematics professors, physicists, even parapsychologists. But they all brush me off. They think I had a breakdown, that I imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, what I heard. I know the thin membrane that separates our reality from others. And it's still out there, just beyond the veil. I still watch. I still listen. I prepare. Because the last time, I was lucky. But what if it comes again? The thing that walked through the breach, the ancient, patient intelligence with its precise, terrible steps, it hasn't given up. It's still walking, still counting, still coming. And I'm not sure I'll be able to stop it a second time. That's when I started to believe something else. There's a theory, one I had always dismissed, that certain frequencies exist beyond our perception. Frequencies that vibrate in spaces we can't access. I didn't believe it, not until I heard the voice. Just 3 words at first: get out now. Buried in the background noise of a track I was mixing. 3 words that would change everything, that would make me question the boundary between sound and consciousness, between what we hear and what hears us. I first noticed the anomaly one late Tuesday night, working alone in my home studio. The deadline for my latest film score was approaching, and I had pushed myself to the brink of exhaustion. Coffee had become my only fuel, my ambition the only thing keeping me awake. My career had been stagnating for years. But this project, this psychological thriller for a young, up-and-coming director, was my shot. It was my chance to break through. The clock on my digital audio workstation read 3:17 a.m. when I played back the haunting string arrangement I had been laboring over. Something was wrong. I could feel it. The mix was off. I had combined live instruments with digital samples, but there was a strange texture, a resonance I couldn't place. I slipped my headphones back on, closed my eyes, and focused. That's when I heard it. Get out now. The words were faint, a whisper buried beneath the noise, but they were unmistakable, human, clear. My heart stopped. I stared at the waveform display, searching for any sign of the voice. It didn't register on the screen. No visual representation. It was just there, floating in the audio. I removed my headphones. The sudden silence of the room pressed in on me. The air felt different, colder, heavier. My apartment felt observed. I told myself it was nothing. Just exhaustion, a trick of the mind. But I couldn't shake it. The voice, those words, were real. And I had heard them. The human brain is wired to detect patterns in randomness, to hear familiar words in static, to find meaning in chaos. I had read about this phenomenon before, auditory pareidolia, they called it. Our minds, exhausted and stretched thin, could trick us into thinking we heard things that weren't really there. It was nothing more than my sleep deprivation, I told myself. Just the pressure of the looming deadline, coupled with the noise of my overworked mind. So, I exported the track, pushed the voice to the back of my thoughts, and went to bed. The next day, refreshed and eager to tackle the next task, I returned to my studio. I had almost forgotten about the strange voice, until I opened the session from the night before to reference a motif. I played back the exported file, listening carefully, expecting to hear nothing out of the ordinary. But then, when I soloed the string section and boosted certain frequencies, I heard it again. Why are you still here? You were warned. My stomach lurched. This time, the voice was clearer, more articulate, with a sinister sibilance that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone, had infiltrated my recording. My heart pounded in my chest as the voice repeated its message, more pronounced now, lingering in the background like a shadow. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my equipment had picked up radio interference, or crossed signals from another device. I'd heard stories of old analog systems accidentally capturing transmissions from radios or baby monitors. But my setup was entirely digital, designed specifically to prevent such interference. My gear wasn't supposed to be susceptible to this kind of phenomenon. I spent hours analyzing the audio, running it through spectrum analyzers, noise reduction software, but nothing unusual showed up. According to every metric, the recording was clean. But when I played it back, the voice remained, undeniable and steadily growing clearer, more coherent with each pass. My initial fascination morphed into obsession. I stopped working on the film score altogether, devoting myself entirely to capturing these anomalies. I recorded hours of ambient room noise, letting my microphones run while I slept, while I wasn't home, testing every angle, every setting, hoping for more voices. The results were disturbing. Not only did I keep capturing voices, but they grew increasingly complex. They started conversing with one another, commenting on changes I'd made to my equipment, questioning the configurations I had set up. I even heard voices commenting on personal conversations I thought I'd had in private, just with myself. The fear started to settle in. One recording was particularly unnerving. It described, with chilling accuracy, a nightmare I'd had the previous night, a nightmare I hadn't told anyone about, not even Marcus. It felt like a violation, like something was digging into my mind, unearthing the deepest corners of my thoughts. Desperate for confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, I called Marcus, a sound engineer who had helped me set up my studio years ago. When he arrived the next afternoon, I could see the concern in his eyes. He could tell something was wrong. I played him the recordings, watching his face for any sign of recognition, of understanding. He listened quietly, expression neutral, until the end. Then, slowly, he shook his head, apologizing gently. "You've been working too hard," he said. "Your ears are fatigued. You're hearing things. This is just a trick of the mind." I insisted, growing increasingly agitated, that something was wrong, that the voices were real. Finally, to humor me, he ran his own analysis on the files. His conclusion? There was nothing there. No voices, no anomalies, just music and ambient room noise. I felt the crushing weight of silence settle around me. "You'll be fine," he reassured me, his voice soft but firm. "It's just stress. You need to get some rest." After he left, promising to check in with me in a few days, I sat alone in the suffocating silence of my studio, questioning everything I had heard, everything I had felt. Then, as if to punish me for my doubt, my monitor speakers crackled to life. They hadn't been powered on. And from them, louder than ever before, a voice filled the room. "He can't hear us. Not everyone is attuned to our frequency, but you are. You've always been sensitive to us, even before you knew we existed." My heart slammed against my ribs. Sweat broke out across my forehead, my hands trembling. I wasn't imagining it. The voices were real. But for some reason, only I could hear them. Panic set in, and I shakily asked, "What do you want from me?" The response came not through the speakers, but directly in my mind. It bypassed the physical world entirely. "We need a conductor, a translator, someone to bridge our world with yours." The voice felt like it wasn't just speaking to me, it was speaking through me. And at that moment, I realized the truth. My equipment wasn't just picking up random interference. It was communicating with something beyond our perception. Something that existed as pure sound. These entities, whatever they were, inhabited frequencies just beyond normal human awareness. They were reaching out, trying to break through. And I was the conduit. That night, as the voices continued their relentless murmurings, I couldn't deny it anymore. My recording equipment had become a doorway, an anchor to a world that existed beyond sight, beyond touch. They were calling me, and I was listening. And I was starting to wonder if it was too late to close the door. My digital audio workstation had become more than a tool, it was a conduit, a doorway between dimensions, not separated by space, but by sound. The entities began to explain, in fragmented whispers across multiple recordings, that they had existed alongside humanity for millennia. They had occasionally crossed over through sensitive individuals, musicians, composers, sound engineers. What humans often interpreted as divine inspiration or artistic genius had, in fact, been their influence seeping through. I should have been terrified, paralyzed with fear, but instead, a perverse sense of privilege washed over me. I'd been chosen. My career, stagnant for years, suddenly felt like the necessary preparation for this moment, the moment when the veil between worlds had been lifted. This revelation was mine to carry, mine to shape. The entities promised to help me create music unlike anything the world had ever heard. They told me that the music I would create under their guidance would affect listeners on a profound neurological level. And they delivered. My work transformed. The score I had been struggling with for weeks, fighting with every note, flowed effortlessly from my fingertips. It was as if the music wasn't coming from me at all, but through me. Each note, each chord, was infused with harmonic structures and microscopic variations that seemed to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to something deeper within the listener. It was no longer just music, it was a language, one that resonated with the very fabric of consciousness. When I presented the completed work to the director, he sat in stunned silence. Tears streamed down his face as he listened, unable to explain why the music affected him so deeply. He just knew that it was perfect. The film, with its hypnotic score, became a critical sensation. Numerous reviews highlighted the transcendent, almost otherworldly quality of the music, noting how it seemed to move beyond the typical cinematic experience, leaving the audience entranced. Offers for new projects flooded in. For the first time in my career, I had a choice. I could be selective, choosing only the projects that felt right. But I wasn't just choosing the work, I was choosing which collaborators to bring into this strange new fold. By now, I had grown accustomed to the voices, the guidance. And during my third project under their influence, something began to stir in the back of my mind. I noticed patterns in the frequencies they encouraged me to use, subtle modulations that when analyzed mathematically formed complex structures. It wasn't just that the music resonated emotionally with listeners. They weren't just creating beautiful sound. They were encoding messages, hidden within the music itself. When analyzed with a sharp enough eye, I realized that these modulations formed a language, an intricate system embedded in the music. The frequencies were calculated to affect listeners on a deeper, subconscious level. Each composition I created was planting seeds, subtle instructions, preparing the listeners for what they called the harmonization. The harmonization, they explained, was a synchronization of human consciousness through sound. My music was being used to create a network of minds, all attuned to their frequency. These individuals, listeners of my music, were becoming more receptive to direct communication from these entities. I should have been horrified. My entire existence had become an instrument of something I couldn't fully comprehend. But by then, I was too immersed in their world. Too dependent on their guidance. My thoughts, my creativity, had become so intertwined with their influence that I could no longer distinguish where I ended and where they began. My success, my renewed sense of purpose, all of it, every step forward, was now tied to them. As my music spread across streaming platforms, in film screenings, and in public spaces, I began to monitor its effects. I scoured social media for feedback, searching for signs of its influence. Listeners reported intense emotional responses, vivid dreams featuring sounds they couldn't describe, and a strange sense of connection to others who had heard the same compositions. Some listeners even claimed to hear whispers beneath the music, voices speaking directly to them. As the network of minds grew, so did the power of the entity that was behind it all. But in rare moments of clarity, when their voices receded, when I could think for myself, doubts crept in. Was I really helping to create something beautiful, or was I unwittingly facilitating an invasion? What if this harmonization was not a gift, but a form of colonization? What if they were manipulating me, using my music to create a bridge into human consciousness, an invasion through sound? I had thought I was creating something for humanity, but now I began to wonder if I was merely serving as a vessel for something far darker. Then, one night, I discovered something that shattered the last remnants of my complacency. Hidden in my digital audio workstation's temporary files was a folder I didn't remember creating. It was full of compositions I had no recollection of working on. I opened one of the files, and my hands froze. The music was perfect, too perfect. It was a composition I had never written, a piece so intricate, so layered with complexity that it couldn't possibly be human-made. It was the voice I had heard earlier, embedded into the very fabric of the music, speaking through every note, every chord, every beat. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't just creating music anymore, I was being used. I had become the conduit for an alien intelligence, orchestrating its invasion, its harmonization, one listener at a time. The music had already spread too far. It was too late to stop it. And as I listened to the haunting, perfect compositions that I had never written, I understood the terrifying truth: they had already won. These weren't simply film scores or commissioned works anymore. These were functional sounds, designed for public address systems, elevator music, the hold music you hear when dialing into customer service, streaming platform intros, and other background audio environments that saturate daily life. The entities had been using my professional credentials, my identity as a composer, to subtly distribute their encoded messages through the most pervasive channels imaginable. Millions of people were unknowingly receiving their influence, even though they had never listened to my film scores. The scope of their plan was far more extensive than I had initially realized. The more I thought about it, the more I understood, it wasn't just about me anymore. They had infiltrated the background noise of the world, everything from the mundane to the extraordinary. That night, in a desperate bid to stop it, I destroyed my studio. I smashed my monitors, dismantled my computers, shredded cables, anything that could serve as a conduit for their voices. Blood dripped from my hands as I tore equipment from the walls, my throat raw from screaming counter-frequencies I instinctively believed might disrupt their transmission. The neighbors called the police, and when they arrived, they found me in the corner of the destroyed room, babbling about frequencies, mind control, and interdimensional communication. They didn't understand. I was convinced that the voices were real. They diagnosed me with acute psychosis, triggered by professional pressure and sleep deprivation. I spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility, where the doctors were kind, but firm in their interpretation of my experiences. They insisted that I had suffered a break from reality. The sudden professional success, the shift from failure to immediate recognition, had caused me to construct an elaborate delusion. They believed I had created these entities as personifications of my own repressed creativity and my fear of success. Without my equipment, without the constant whisper of their guidance, my thoughts gradually cleared. I began to wonder if they were right. Perhaps I had created them in my mind, manifestations of my own internal struggles, my desperate need for validation. When I was released, I left my professional connections behind. I moved to a small apartment in another city, far from the world I had known. I stopped using all forms of electronic sound equipment and listened only to acoustic instruments played live. I needed to find peace, to silence the noise. For 6 months, nothing unusual happened. No voices, no entities, no whispering patterns in my mind. I began to rebuild my life. I took a job teaching music theory at a small community college, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. But then, yesterday, one of my students brought in a composition to show me. It was a simple piece, something she'd created using a consumer-grade digital audio workstation, similar to the professional system I once used. As she played it back on her laptop, my blood ran cold. Beneath her simple melody, barely perceptible but unmistakable to my trained ear, was a familiar pattern. It was a signature I recognized immediately. The same frequency. The same mathematical sequence I had once used, guided by the entities. They had found someone new, someone else attuned to their frequency. From the structure of the composition, it was clear that they were much further along in their manipulation than I had been when I first discovered them. I should warn her. I should destroy her laptop, erase all traces of this. I should report my findings to someone, anyone, with the authority to understand what's happening. But who would believe me? A former film composer, recently diagnosed with psychosis, claiming that sound itself is being weaponized by interdimensional entities? Who would take that seriously? As I sit here, writing this, I've come to a disturbing realization. Perhaps I was never special. Perhaps I was just one node in their growing network, one conductor among many. Maybe they're spreading through home studios and bedroom producers across the world, leveraging our cultural obsession with content creation and digital distribution. I've started hearing them again, not through speakers or headphones, but directly, like my auditory processing has been permanently altered to detect their frequency. They're closer now, more pervasive than ever before. They whisper that resistance is futile, that the harmonization is inevitable. Sound travels everywhere, they say. It touches everyone. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I catch myself humming melodies I don't recognize, complex, haunting progressions that send chills down my spine. I recognize them now. It's the sound of their influence. It's the sound of them spreading. I try to stop, but the patterns repeat. They burrow deeper into my consciousness, embedding themselves with each iteration. I wonder how many others are out there, unknowingly serving as conductors in this growing symphony of influence. How many more are silently becoming attuned to the frequencies that I now understand? I wonder if, one day, we will all be connected, linked by these vibrations, a vast network of minds synchronized to a rhythm that isn't our own. And I wonder if, by the time that happens, we will even remember what our own thoughts sounded like. Will we have any sense of individuality left? The harmonization is coming, and there is nowhere you can go where sound won't follow. It's already too late, and it will only get worse. What was once subtle, just a whisper in the distance, is now a full-scale invasion. Soon, it will be impossible to escape. The frequencies are already taking hold, and it's only a matter of time before we're all part of the same collective, whether we like it or not. The vibrations came first. Subtle tremors, almost imperceptible at first, creeping through the floorboards, a low hum that I dismissed as the settling of an old building. But then the sounds began. At night, faint at first, like whispers just beyond the reach of perception, but unmistakable in the dead of night. The rhythmic clink of metal chains dragging across pavement, and the hollow clop of hooves striking stone. Impossible sounds, sounds that should not exist on the 10th floor of a high-rise apartment complex in downtown Portland. And yet, night after night, they persisted. They grew louder, more insistent, like something outside my window was demanding to be acknowledged. 3 weeks ago, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Warning, 1012, Westbrook Heights, negative energy convergence." I almost deleted it as spam. But something about the specificity of my address caught my attention. The message was brief, cryptic, almost too precise to dismiss. Your residence exists at a nexus point of historical trauma. The boundaries between worlds thin where blood has saturated soil. Listen carefully. What begins as sound will manifest physically. Protect yourself before the gateway fully forms. I forwarded it to the building manager with a half-hearted joke about our haunted building. His response was dismissive, almost hurried, suggesting I ignore internet trolls and assuring me the building had passed all inspections. But there was something in his rushed response, a hint of unease that left me feeling unsettled. That night, I heard the chains for the first time. It was just after 3 a.m. when I jolted awake, my skin slick with cold sweat despite the autumn chill. The sound was distant but distinct, the rhythmic scraping of metal links dragging across concrete, punctuated by the slow, deliberate clop of hooves striking pavement. My apartment faced an empty courtyard. There were no horses in downtown Portland. Certainly none 10 stories up. I pressed my ear against the window glass, straining to hear more. But the sound had stopped. I heard nothing. I returned to bed, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the sounds resumed, faint at first, then growing louder, as though they only existed when I wasn't directly observing them. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, or perhaps some odd acoustical phenomenon bouncing sounds from the street below. The human mind is skilled at rationalizing the inexplicable. The second night, the sounds returned, more distinctly. The chains rattled against each other, the hooves striking the pavement with increasing urgency. I grabbed my phone and recorded the sounds, but when I played it back, all I heard was static. A technical glitch, I told myself, ignoring how my hands trembled as I deleted the file. In the following days, I researched the history of the land beneath our building. The library archives revealed that before the apartment complex, the site had housed a furniture warehouse, and before that, a textile factory dating back to the early 1900s. Nothing sinister. No historical trauma, no ghosts, no supernatural occurrences, just a regular piece of city history. But still, the dread lingered, gnawing at my every waking moment. I found myself avoiding my apartment, staying late at the office, accepting dinner invitations I would normally decline. The sounds continued to evolve. What had begun as simple chains and hooves expanded into a grotesque symphony of noises. I heard the creak of wooden structures being assembled, the metallic squeal of mechanisms being tightened, and underneath it all, a sound I couldn't, or wouldn't, identify, a noise that was somewhere between a whimper and a moan, layered upon itself, growing louder with every passing night. 10 days after the first email, I received another message. The subject line read, "The portal strengthens." Historical echoes become physical reality when sufficient acoustic resonance is achieved. They are using sound to rebuild their gateway. The message included a cryptic line, "Research the Westbrook Gallows, 1867 to 1892. I searched for any information related to the Westbrook Gallows, but I found nothing. Not even an entry on historical gallows. Instead, I found references to Judge Westbrook, a notorious 19th-century figure known for his harsh sentences and brutal enforcement of the law. But the sound was still there, echoing through my apartment. The chains, the hooves, the mysterious whispers growing louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't escape it. Something was trying to come through, and it wasn't just sound, it was a doorway, a conduit for something older, something that had been waiting for the right conditions. And those conditions were now being met. The gateway was forming. The vibrations were intensifying. The resonance was growing stronger. And as I listened to the sounds, my mind began to unravel the terrifying truth: I was living in the nexus. The breach was widening. And I was powerless to stop it. The neighborhood had once been called Westbrook Commons. The connection seemed tenuous, but my mouth went dry as I considered the implications. The next day, I visited the Historical Society, claiming I was researching for a novel. The elderly archivist studied me carefully before retrieving a thin folder labeled Westbrook Public Punishments. Most of these records were destroyed in the fire of 1907, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Officials at the time claimed it was to modernize record-keeping, but rumors suggest they wanted certain aspects of the city's history erased. The surviving documents confirmed my worst fears. For 25 years, the site had hosted public executions and punishment spectacles. The gallows were just the centerpiece of what amounted to a theater of cruelty, complete with pillories, whipping posts, and elaborate mechanisms designed to extend suffering for the entertainment of crowds that sometimes numbered in the thousands. They called it Justice Square, the archivist added, watching my reaction carefully. But locals had another name for it, the Symphony of Screams. Supposedly, on execution days, the sounds could be heard for miles. I thanked her, my mouth dry, feeling like it was lined with cotton, and left, the weight of this knowledge pressing down on my chest. The city had built luxury apartments on top of a torture ground, covering the blood-soaked earth with concrete and steel, offering no acknowledgement, no atonement for what had happened there. That night, the acoustic manifestations reached a new level of clarity. I could now distinguish individual components, each sound taking on a life of its own. The cracking of whips, the turning of gears, the murmuring of a crowd growing more excited, each noise a calculated note in the macabre symphony. The architect of this twisted composition seemed to be arranging each element with the same precision as a conductor leading an orchestra. The sounds no longer came from outside my window, they seemed to emanate from within the very walls, as if the building itself had become a massive speaker, vibrating with the resonance of past horrors. The entire structure was alive with them. I could feel the vibrations deep in my bones. My body responded with primal fear, my heart pounded against my ribs so violently that I feared they might crack. Sweat poured from me, despite the cold autumn air soaking my sheets. My breath came in shallow gasps that never seemed to fill my lungs. My limbs felt heavy, as though they were weighed down by an unseen force. When I tried to stand, my legs buckled beneath me, muscles seizing with the instinctual need to flee from something that my rational mind could not accept. I crawled to the bathroom, barely making it before I vomited until nothing remained but bitter bile. Staring into the mirror, my reflection looked foreign, like a stranger wearing my face. My eyes were too wide, my skin too pale, as if I had been transformed by terror. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I needed confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. I knocked on the door of my neighbor across the hall, a graduate student who kept odd hours. She answered, her initial irritation quickly shifting to concern when she saw me. I asked if she had heard anything unusual at night. Her expression, confused, almost pitying, told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. I didn't hear anything. No chains, no hooves, no sounds at all. Just the usual city noise. She suggested carbon monoxide poisoning, or maybe I should see someone about auditory hallucinations. I nodded, retreating, knowing how I must appear, disheveled, wild-eyed, drenched in sweat from an unknown terror. As her door closed behind me, I caught her reaching for her phone, likely to report a disturbance. I couldn't blame her. But back in my apartment, the sounds had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt artificial. It was as if the world outside my walls had ceased to exist. I collapsed into bed, exhaustion finally overcoming terror, and fell into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, I discovered the first physical manifestation of the disturbance. A thin layer of dirt had covered my living room floor. Not the dust of neglected housekeeping, but actual soil, dark and rich, forming a perfect circle approximately 6 feet in diameter. When I touched it, the dirt was cold and damp, as if it had been recently excavated from deep underground. Panic washed over me. The ground beneath my feet had shifted. The sound was no longer just a haunting manifestation, it was breaking through into my reality, reshaping the very space I inhabited. It wasn't just a memory of the past reverberating through the walls. It was something far worse. The gateway was opening, and it wasn't satisfied with whispers anymore. It was bringing the horrors of the past into the present. Even more disturbing still, the dirt contained fragments of what appeared to be bone. Small, weathered pieces, too disturbing to examine closely. I swept it up, hurriedly dumping it down the garbage chute, then scrubbed the floor with all my might until my hands were raw, desperate to erase the evidence. But the feeling of contamination lingered, like I couldn't scrub enough to remove what had taken root in that space. Later that day, I contacted a realtor to break my lease, citing urgent family matters. The earliest I could move was 3 weeks away. I considered checking into a hotel, but the cost of an extended stay on top of my rent was prohibitive. So, I purchased sleeping pills, noise-canceling headphones, blackout curtains, anything I could think of to create a barrier between myself and whatever was trying to break through. But none of it worked. The noises grew louder, more insistent, relentlessly pushing through all my defenses. 2 nights ago, I awoke to find my furniture rearranged. Every piece had been pushed against the walls, leaving the center of the room clear. There, where the dirt had appeared, now stood a crude outline formed of rust-colored dust, a rough, unmistakable shape of a gallows. My throat constricted at the sight, the pressure around my neck almost physical, as if the executioner's rope was tightening even before the execution. It wasn't entirely psychosomatic. I tried to disperse the outline with my foot, but the dust clung to the floor as if magnetized, refusing to be moved. The sensation of being trapped, the sound of the chains, the hooves, the distant cries, grew louder in my ears, pressing in from all directions. But last night, I witnessed the culmination of their efforts. The sounds reached a crescendo around midnight. What had begun as historical echoes now became a deliberate construction. Each component of the acoustic architecture locked into place with terrifying precision. The temperature in my apartment dropped drastically, so quickly that my breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. The center of my living room floor began to ripple like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The hardwood no longer felt solid beneath my feet. It became fluid, reflective, as if the ground itself was warping and distorting to allow something to rise from below. And then it began. From the depths of the floor, shadows began to move, indistinct at first, but then growing in definition with every passing second. Human shapes, dozens of them, pressing upward as if against a membrane, their features twisted and stretched. But their intentions were clear. Hands reached toward the barrier, pushing, testing its resilience. I backed into the farthest corner of the room, pressing myself against the wall, hoping that somehow, some way, I could phase through it. But the cold, oppressive presence around me only grew stronger. My entire body convulsed with tremors I couldn't control. The rational part of my brain shut down entirely, leaving only the primal instinct for survival. My body screamed, my nerves on fire, but I couldn't escape. A face pressed against the barrier from below, its features distorted in an expression between rage and ecstatic anticipation. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, and though I heard no sound, I felt the vibration of it scream through the floorboards beneath me. The intensity of it almost cracked my skull. More faces joined the first, a mosaic of contorted visages, all focused on me with a terrible recognition, as though they had been waiting for me. They pressed against the barrier, the membrane between worlds stretching thinner and thinner, becoming almost transparent. I could see now what lay beneath. It wasn't some metaphysical hell. No. It was the historical reality of what had once existed here, the gallows platform, the mechanisms of torture, the eager crowd, history itself attempting to reclaim its space in the present. In my panic, I remembered something from my research. Acoustic standing waves could be disrupted by introducing counterharmonics, frequencies designed to cancel each other out. With shaking hands, I connected my phone to my speakers and played the loudest, most discordant music I could find, at maximum volume. The effect was immediate. The membrane rippled violently, the faces beneath it contorting in what appeared to be pain, or frustration. The temperature fluctuated wildly as the portal struggled to maintain its integrity. I grabbed my emergency backpack, throwing it over my shoulder, and fled the apartment. The cacophony of my impromptu countermeasure followed me down the hallway, growing louder, more insistent. The barrier fought back, but I had no time to waste. I spent the night in my car, parked under the bright lights of a 24-hour store parking lot. I couldn't go back to that apartment. Not yet. The next morning, I returned briefly, just long enough to grab essential documents and a change of clothes. The portal had receded, leaving behind a perfect circle of scorched flooring, the earth beneath my feet forever tainted by the horrors that had risen from it. Tonight will be worse. I can feel it. They're learning. Adapting. Their acoustic architecture is evolving, finding ways to overcome resistance. The portal will form again, and this time, it will be stronger. I don't know how much longer I can keep running from them. But one thing is certain, they're not done with me yet. They're still coming. And the next time, the breach will be permanent. The barrier grows thinner with each attempt. I'm writing this from a coffee shop across town, hoping that distance might weaken their ability to reach me. But I can still feel the vibrations. Subtle tremors under the table, faint but unmistakable, the sound of chains dragging across pavement just at the edge of hearing. It's not the apartment that is the portal, I realize now. It's me. They've been using the acoustics to attune me, to make me a conduit for their presence. I found a motel 50 miles away where I'll stay tonight. But deep down, I don't believe it will make a difference. The chains will follow. The symphony will continue. The gateway will open again. And when it does, I won't fight it. This time, I'll face whatever comes through, not with counterharmonics, but with acknowledgement. These souls, these entities, they don't seek vengeance. They seek recognition, remembrance. Their suffering was erased from history, buried beneath layers of time and concrete. Perhaps that is the true unfinished business, the thing that keeps them bound to this place, to this land. Tomorrow, I'll contact the Historical Society about establishing a proper memorial. It's a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, by acknowledging the past, I can close the acoustic gateway before it fully forms. For now, though, I sit in this unfamiliar room, listening as the first faint clink of chains begins again outside my window, 10 feet above the parking lot, impossibly close, and growing closer. I still feel a chill run up my spine whenever I recall that first evening. The air in the office had turned strangely stagnant, as though the building itself was holding its breath, making every inhalation feel stifled, heavy. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows against the walls. I remember looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was there, only to find empty corridors stretching into darkness. By then, most of my coworkers had left for the day, and the entire office had taken on the haunting quiet of a labyrinth, silent cubicles, half-lit conference rooms, and corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. Something felt wrong. Unsettling. Unknowable. My name is Ryan Grant, and I worked in the administrative department of a major consulting company. I used to consider myself rational, calm under pressure, the kind of person who double-checked everything before jumping to conclusions. But that night changed everything I believed about logic, reason, and reality itself. I had always prided myself on having a clear mind, one free of doubts or distractions. But when I saw him, the stranger, walk into the conference room after hours, that clarity shattered. My sense of reality began to bend in ways I never thought possible. Let me start from the beginning. I had been staying late, working to finalize a set of financial reports. The office was almost completely empty when I heard it, the subtle click of a door somewhere down the hallway. It puzzled me because everyone else had gone home. At first, I dismissed it, assuming the cleaning staff had arrived early. But the silence that followed felt off. It dragged on uncomfortably, as if whoever had opened the door was standing very still, just listening. My heart gave a slight lurch in my chest. For a moment, the entire building seemed suspended in that single instant of quiet. Then, I decided to check the conference room. It was supposed to be locked at this hour. When I reached the conference area, the door was slightly ajar. The overhead lights were on, casting a cold, sterile light over the room. My pulse quickened, and my palms became clammy as I pushed the door open. There, standing at the far end of the table, was a man in a dark suit. His back was turned to me, his posture rigid, and he seemed to be staring at the company's projector screen, which displayed an idle blue glow. I felt compelled to speak, to ask if he needed anything, but the words died in my throat. A nervous dryness replaced my voice. I took a shaky step forward, wanting to help, to understand what was going on. But before I could speak, he moved. No, it was more like he flickered. He didn't walk, he just flickered to the opposite wall, almost too fast for my eyes to track. My breath caught in my throat. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, he was gone. The conference room was empty. The overhead lights continued to hum, casting long shadows on the floor. I stood there, paralyzed for a moment. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of my tired mind. After all, I had been working late for hours. It was nothing more than the result of fatigue, I told myself. My entire body buzzed with adrenaline, though, and I couldn't ignore how my chest pounded or how the small hairs on my neck refused to lie flat. I turned and left the room, the feeling of being watched lingering on my skin. Something in the air felt wrong, like the very walls were watching me, waiting. I tried to shake it off, but the unease followed me, gnawing at my thoughts. The next morning, I told myself it had been a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The flickering man was no ordinary figure, and he wasn't just a product of my imagination. The building, the office, it had become a place where something else was waiting. And whatever it wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that I had seen something I couldn't explain, or the terrifying feeling that it had seen me. Despite my unease, I shut off the lights, locked the door, and forced myself to breathe slowly. As I made my way out, I noticed the cleaning staff's cart down the hallway, but no one was around. The echo of my footsteps felt far too loud, unsettling. The air was thick with silence, and it seemed to carry a weight, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I dismissed the entire incident as stress-induced. After all, it had been a long, tiring day, and I was still adjusting to the pressures of work. But when I sat down at my desk to open the files I had saved the night before, my stomach dropped. Entire paragraphs had been replaced by nonsensical symbols, a jumble of characters that didn't belong. Some data columns had even reversed themselves, and email timestamps had been altered, distorting the entire workflow. Nobody else in the office reported any system issues, and the IT department insisted that everything was functioning normally. But a cold tension crept into my gut. How could there be no trace of a system glitch? How could this happen without any explanation? I tried to bring it up to my manager in a roundabout way. I mentioned the strange file corruptions, hoping for some insight or acknowledgement, but they seemed too busy to pay much attention. My manager responded with a vague assurance that any software issue would be handled and rushed off to another meeting. I was left standing there, feeling increasingly isolated, my concerns dismissed as mere technical hiccups. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. That evening, I stayed behind again, determined to confirm whether the stranger would return. The office was quiet, too quiet, and I felt my anxiety growing with every passing minute. Around 8 p.m., the main office light switched into power-saving mode, and the suffocating stillness returned. My breath quickened as I became hyper-aware of every soft click and hum from the ventilation system. The rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat throbbed in my temples. The emptiness of the building made my legs jittery, like they wanted to bolt but were rooted in place, unable to move. And then, I heard it. The door to the conference room squeaked open. My mouth went dry. The footsteps, the same unmistakable, deliberate footsteps, betrayed my presence as I crept closer. My body tensed, but I couldn't pull away. I peeked through the small glass panel of the door and saw him again, the same man in a dark suit, his expression concealed by the shadows. His movements were fluid, unnaturally smooth, as he ran a hand across the meeting table, his attention fixed on something only he could see. I couldn't take it anymore. In a burst of bravery, I opened the door and demanded to know who he was. My voice sounded thin and strained, even to my own ears. He turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of his face in the flickering overhead light. That fraction of a look was enough to send my pulse hammering in my chest. His features, his skin, seemed blurred, not quite aligning with the bone structure beneath, as though his skin wasn't resting correctly on his body. It was as if the very shape of him was unstable, fluctuating between forms, not quite real. He began to speak, but the words were garbled, distorted like a broken recording. The only coherent phrase I caught, spoken with unsettling precision, was, "unfinished obligations." Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. No sound, no trace. Just a faint shimmer in the air that dissolved almost instantly, like a mirage fading under the harsh light. My body trembled with shock, and my mind struggled to process what I had just witnessed. I could hardly breathe. I had to grip the back of a chair to steady myself. Over the next week, strange occurrences continued. Emails I had sent were rearranged, their contents altered to convey conflicting messages. Confidential spreadsheets were manipulated in ways that made no logical sense. I overheard a coworker mention receiving odd phone calls where no one spoke, just static, a low humming. The air around me was thick with a sense of something being wrong, but I kept these observations to myself. I was starting to question my sanity, wondering if my exhaustion had led me to hallucinate all of this. Yet, each time I convinced myself that it wasn't real, something else would happen. I'd discover more tampered files or catch a glimpse of movement in hallways that should have been deserted. It was too consistent, too real to ignore. One night, I stayed late on purpose, determined to gather proof of what was happening. I set up my phone to record the conference room from a discreet corner of the office. My plan was simple: if the stranger appeared again, would have evidence. Hours dragged on, my mind numb with exhaustion. My muscles ached, and I couldn't shake the constant tingling in my fingers, the sense that something was about to happen. Finally, around 10 p.m., I heard it again, the metallic click of the conference room door. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen for a moment, bracing myself for what I knew would come. My throat clenched as I watched the man's silhouette pace around the table through the glass panel. My breaths were shallow, and I reminded myself not to panic. My phone was recording everything, or at least, I hoped it was. I forced myself to focus, watching for several minutes as he moved. The man lifted the conference phone, pressed a few buttons, and set it back down with deliberate care. Then, as had happened before, he disappeared. No trace remained of him, not even a flicker of movement. I rushed to check the recording, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I played it back, all I found was static. However, faint shapes flickered in and out of frame, accompanied by that same low hum my coworker had described. My pulse quickened with each viewing, and I replayed it over and over. Toward the end of the video, the distortion on the screen shifted, forming what looked like silhouettes, more than one. The shapes flickered so rapidly that I couldn't be certain, but it appeared to be a small group of figures, standing side by side, all facing the camera. By then, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it might escape my chest. I nearly dropped my phone in alarm. Desperate to understand what was happening, I began digging into the company's history. It was mostly rumor and speculation, but a few older employees spoke in hushed tones about a catastrophic incident from years ago. Official records were incomplete, offering only vague references to an unfortunate event. Some claimed a group of workers had simply vanished after a malfunction in a new facility. Others insisted it was just corporate myth. No one had definitive answers, but there was an air of quiet apprehension. It was safer, it seemed, not to pry. Driven by an obsessive need for answers, I spent hours at the library, combing through archived documents. I needed something, anything, that could shed light on the nature of this rumored accident. The more I uncovered, the more I realized something had been carefully swept under the rug. Some articles hinted at an experiment or perhaps a new industrial process that had gone horribly wrong, leading to the disappearance of employees under highly secretive circumstances. The company had never openly acknowledged it, and their official statements dodged direct questions. There were no specifics, only gaps in the records that were suspiciously blank. As I pieced together the fragments of information, a dreadful tension began to creep in. My heartbeat felt perpetually unsettled, skipping in frantic rhythms if I allowed my mind to wander. My appetite vanished, replaced by a nauseating churn in my stomach. The building itself felt different to me now, as though it were watching my every move. Some corridors seemed to stretch longer than I remembered, the angles of the walls subtly off. My reflection in the glass windows occasionally seemed slightly askew, my eyes flicking from side to side, even when I stood perfectly still. I wasn't sure anymore if I was witnessing actual anomalies or if I was losing my grip on what was real. One evening, I decided to re-examine the digital logs of our office's security system. For hours, I scrolled through timestamps, comparing them to my own experiences. The logs showed no entries for those times when I had heard the door open. It was as if the intruder had bypassed the system entirely. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. New lines of data had been inserted into random days, referencing non-existent visitors. As I analyzed the data more closely, I saw a pattern, hidden code embedded within. My chest tightened as the horrifying realization dawned on me. This being, or perhaps multiple beings, were rewriting not just spreadsheets, but the very data that documented their presence in the building. I quietly approached an IT specialist, hoping for some clarity. I asked if they had noticed any weird anomalies, anything out of the ordinary. They shrugged, their face flushing slightly with discomfort. "Some things are better left alone," they muttered, the tone of their voice far from reassuring. It wasn't casual, it was a subtle warning. My skin prickled with unease. Determined to break the cycle, I cornered the cleaning staff one night. I asked if they had seen anything unusual. After a long pause, one of them admitted, her voice hesitant and halting, that she sometimes glimpsed shadows moving in the corners of the office. Reflections that flickered on the polished floors, figures that vanished the moment they turned to look. I felt my blood run cold. The same unnerving phenomena that had been happening to me. It was no longer just a strange occurrence. Something was happening in this building, something far darker than I could comprehend. I wasn't crazy. There was something else here. And as the days passed, I realized that whatever it was getting closer. It matched my experiences perfectly. This wasn't just a hallucination. With a renewed sense of urgency, I convinced myself to watch the distorted footage from my phone again in detail, hoping to decode the shapes. As I sat in a lonely break room, the overhead fluorescent light flickering erratically, I replayed the video frame by frame. My heart thudded violently in my chest, my breath growing ragged with every passing second. Every muscle in my body was taut, as if I were waiting for something to leap out of the screen. Goosebumps raced up my arms. At one point, the interference formed a series of flickering lines, almost resembling letters. I paused the video, reversed it, and tried desperately to stabilize the distortion. Then, in the shifting chaos, a single word emerged: return. Something inside me twisted. It wasn't just the word, it was the sensation of being pulled into an invisible vortex, deeper into the darkness, as if the very space around me was becoming a trap. These intruders, I realized, were more than just one strange man, they were a collective presence, intricately connected to an incident the company had buried. They were reaching out from some forgotten place, like they wanted to inhabit the space they once controlled, or perhaps to reclaim something stolen from them. My mind reeled with the possibilities. I remembered the final part of that rumor, the part about the missing staff who had never reappeared. No official explanation was ever given. No one spoke openly about them, but now, it all began to make sense. These apparitions were the manifestation of whatever had truly happened. The frustration, betrayal, and confusion left behind had taken a tangible form, now weaving itself into the digital frameworks and physical corners of the building. Unable to continue living in this constant, oppressive dread, I devised a plan to gather enough evidence to confront the company's upper management. I knew I had to expose them, to show them what was happening. However, as I began preparing a detailed report, screenshots of corrupted data, careful notes of anomalies, the documents kept changing. Every time I opened them, entire sections rearranged themselves, like an invisible hand was rewriting the narrative in real time. It was as though the entity was mocking my attempts at exposure, erasing the evidence before I could even show it. I couldn't fight it. By the final night I spent there, I was teetering on the edge of panic. My breathing was shallow, fast, and I felt dizzy, lightheaded, as if the air itself had become thicker. Every hallway seemed wrong, as if the geometry itself had been altered, stretching and shifting with every step I took. Lights flickered, dimmed, then brightened without warning. My own footsteps echoed strangely, distant, like I was walking on a stage, beneath which something vast and alive stirred. I stumbled into the conference room, determined to make my stand. I flipped on every light, desperate to see clearly. I caught my reflection in the glossy surface of the table, pale, sweating, my eyes wild with fear. A surge of static charged the air, and I felt my hair stand on end as the man in the dark suit materialized across the table from me. My heart hammered so fiercely I thought it might burst. Behind him, several other figures, faint and transparent, hovered, their faces hazy, morphing in and out of focus like static on an old television. I tried to speak, but my words caught in my throat. I could barely manage a choked whisper. Despite the terror that gripped me, I felt a strange empathy. It was as if they were reaching out, not to harm, but to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have their pain recognized. Then, without warning, the room blinked out. For one fleeting moment, I was plunged into total darkness. The hum of the electronics, gone. A whisper of cold air brushed past me, sending a shiver down my spine. When the light snapped back on, the man in the suit was gone. The conference room was intact, the table shining as if nothing had happened. But I knew differently. I could feel in my bones that something fundamental had shifted. I realized then that the entire office had become a stage for their presence, a place where they had been bound ever since the company buried the truth. I fled that night, stumbling through the corridors in a daze until I reached my car. My hands trembled so violently that I had trouble fitting the key into the ignition. The drive home was torturous. Every streetlight I passed seemed oppressive, the shadows stretching far too long, as though they were chasing me. My stomach churned, my mind replaying images of the distorted faces and flickering figures like a broken record. I could still feel their presence. The weight of it pressed on my chest, and I couldn't shake the thought, I was being followed. I never returned to that building. I couldn't. It wasn't just the building anymore, it was a portal, an opening to something far worse than I had ever imagined. I sent an anonymous tip to the press, attaching fragments of the footage and cryptic screenshots. Maybe, just maybe, someone would understand. But I knew deep down, it wouldn't stop. The echoes of the past, the figures trapped in time, would continue their haunting. And I would never be free of them. Whether they'll make sense of it or not is unclear. Part of me worries that nobody will believe it. Part of me worries about what that presence might do if the company tries to hide it again. Even now, I sense the echoes of what I experienced whenever I stare too long at a flickering screen or catch a glimpse of my reflection in a darkened window. The paranoia still lingers, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. My heart still beats faster at the memory of those intangible shapes, and cold sweat dots my temples at the faintest creak in an empty room. Though I've managed to escape that claustrophobic office, the feeling of being watched has never left me. It haunts me in the quietest moments, and I find myself checking my phone for abnormal static or strange distortions in photos, even though I know they're no longer there. Sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a flicker on my computer screen, and my throat tightens with dread. It's as if they remain woven into the digital threads of communication, lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And that is the most unsettling part, the knowledge that their story remains unfinished, just like the disturbing residue they left behind on my recordings. The feeling that I've left an open door for something that will one day return. They demanded a return, a reclamation of something taken from them. If they once haunted only that building, who's to say they cannot extend their reach? I close my eyes, my heart pounding, my mind spiraling in fear, wondering when it will end. The last thing I see before sleep pulls me under is the image of that faceless man standing in the conference room, blurred at the edges, a silent harbinger of truths that refuse to remain buried. I remember the first time I heard it. A harsh, ragged yell that sliced through the silence of my living room like a blade. The sound carried my name, clear and forceful, right against my ear, though I was alone in the house. In that instant, my heart seemed to punch the inside of my ribcage, and a cold rush of panic flooded my veins. I spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind me, a stranger or an intruder. But there was nothing. Just the familiar lamp casting an anemic glow across the bare walls. That was when the terror truly took root. It was like a splinter lodged deep in my mind, a seed of fear that I couldn't ignore or extract. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a slow, relentless unspooling of my reality. From the outside, my house seemed normal enough, a modest two-story structure with creaking floorboards and a yard that refused to grow anything but patchy grass. I'd never felt entirely comfortable here, though. The walls seemed too thin, and the windows let in too little light. There was an almost imperceptible odor in the air, something damp and stale, like wet cement left too long in the dark. Despite this discomfort, I had come to see it as my sanctuary, a place I could retreat to after the daily grind. But that sense of sanctuary vanished the day I heard my name shouted in an empty room. I can't even begin to articulate the sense of violation I felt in that instant. My name is personal. It's an intimate label that ties me to my identity. Hearing it barked out like that, by an unseen intruder, triggered every fight or flight instinct in my body. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my breath caught in my throat, leaving me momentarily paralyzed. I stayed frozen for a few seconds, chest tight, eyes darting around for the source of the voice. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was a bizarre auditory hallucination. Maybe I'd been under too much stress, or I was simply exhausted. With trembling hands, I inspected every room. I opened each door, the hinges creaking, each closet light flickering ominously. But there was no sign of anyone. No sign of an intruder, no sign of forced entry. For a while, I managed to compartmentalize the experience, pushing it into a corner of my mind labeled, one-off weirdness. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it wasn't real. But that night, as I lay in bed, it came again. This time, it sounded different, more like a whisper, but still just as forcibly close, as if someone were leaning right next to my ear. It said my name once, slow and breathy, before fading into silence. My heart clenched in my chest, and the room seemed to press in on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice lingered in my mind, an echo of something I couldn't explain. And that's when I realized, something was here. Something that knew me, something that had found me in the silence of my home. It wasn't just a strange sound, a glitch in my perception. It was a presence, and it was watching me. I bolted upright, heart hammering, cold sweat trickling down my temples. A gnawing dread settled in my stomach as I lay there in the dark, listening intently for any sign of movement. I remained awake for hours, unable to shake the feeling that something was there, watching. As the days passed, the phenomenon escalated. My name reverberated through the house at precise intervals, though I wouldn't notice the pattern until much later. It would come from the living room in the morning, from the kitchen after lunch, from the narrow staircase at dusk. The voices varied too, which was even more unsettling. Sometimes they were deep and resonant, like a low growl. Other times, they were shrill, rasping, as if the speaker was struggling to get the words out. Each call sent an onslaught of adrenaline coursing through my body, making my limbs quiver and my mouth go dry, like sandpaper scraping against my tongue. I developed a constant tension in my shoulders and lower back, as though my body was perpetually braced for the next sudden shout. I tried to confide in a friend, albeit indirectly, mentioning strange noises in my home and suspecting it was just the thin walls or odd acoustics. I didn't dare admit I was hearing my name. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the house's old construction and my overactive imagination. I wanted to believe that too. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just a trick of the house. But late at night, in the dark silence of my bedroom, I couldn't ignore the coldness that seemed to radiate from the corners of the room. I couldn't pretend my heart wasn't skipping beats every time the voice returned. Eventually, I decided to record the occurrences. I placed my phone on a table and hit the audio recorder whenever I felt the intervals approaching. By now, I had noticed the pattern repeating roughly every 6 hours, almost to the minute. Yet, every time I played back the recordings, all I heard was silence or a faint static hiss. No trace of the voices at all. The weight of it pressed on my sanity, piece by piece, unraveling my grip on what was real. The consistency was unnerving. It felt as though some hidden intelligence was carefully timing each whisper, each shout. I couldn't rest, couldn't forget about it. I began tracking each occurrence meticulously in a notebook. I noted the date, the exact time, the room I was in, the approximate direction the voice seemed to come from, and any distinguishing traits of the call. Within a week, my pages were filled with frantic scrawls and cramped diagrams, little arrows representing the direction of each incident. It wasn't until I looked at these maps collectively that I noticed a strange pattern emerging. The lines, the arrows, each new point, seemed to align with a very specific structure. The map looked eerily like an architectural blueprint, with symmetrical corridors and rectangular spaces. The lines were too deliberate, too structured, to be a coincidence. My curiosity overshadowed my fear, at least for a while. I headed to the local archives, hoping to uncover some clue about the land where my house now stood. I dug through old records, uncovering something deeply unsettling. Many decades ago, the land had been home to a makeshift detention facility, essentially a primitive prison designed with a symmetrical layout to maximize security. The building had long since been demolished and replaced with the cluster of homes now occupying the neighborhood. As I looked over the old blueprint in the archive, my stomach twisted. It looked eerily similar to the shapes I had been drawing in my notes. A slow, crawling sensation tightened around my gut as I studied the prison's old layout. Each corridor, each cell, was positioned in exactly the same way as the lines I had drawn to track the voices. I stared at the blueprint, realizing with growing dread that some intangible presence was recreating that structure within my home. It was using these shouted calls as markers, almost like beacons, guiding it to the exact points where it needed to manifest. The discovery ignited a fresh wave of anxiety. My palms grew clammy, and an electric tension spread across my scalp. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that there had to be an explanation. But the more I looked at the data, the more I realized that I had evidence. There was no coincidence here. The voices, the distorted patterns, they were real, they were happening, and they were tied to something far darker than I could have imagined. I tried to show my friend my rough diagrams, hoping he'd see the connection. But he dismissed it, as I had feared. "It's just coincidence," he said. "You're probably just finding patterns in random static." He shrugged it off, suggesting I get some rest and stop overthinking it. I nodded numbly, but inside, I felt a hollow space expand in my chest. His dismissal didn't make it go away. It made it worse. The weight of this growing realization settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that it was just a trick of my mind. Something was happening in that house. Something tied to the land itself, tied to the history buried beneath it. And as I sat in that dimly lit room, staring at the blueprint of a long-forgotten prison, I realized the truth: the voices were just the beginning. The structure was rising again, one call at a time. And whatever had been imprisoned there before, whatever had been buried, is now waking up. I sensed that I was dealing with something far beyond coincidence. The more I researched, the darker the history became. The detention facility was rumored to have housed individuals under the harshest conditions, isolated, starved, tortured. Their voices, their cries, echoed through time, lingering in the very ground. Perhaps that agony had never dissipated. It was still there, clinging to the earth, bleeding into the present. Some reports even hinted at a collective presence, a lingering spirit of sorts that could not move on. Disturbingly, these claims suggested that the presence needed a focus, something living to latch onto, to feed on. The stories were vague about the outcomes, but I had gleaned enough to understand this wasn't just folklore or superstition. This felt real. And I was living it. Back home, I began to sense changes in the physical environment. The house had always been cold, but now it was different. There were cold spots in random places, an unexpected 10-degree drop near the sofa, an unnerving chill around the staircase. My limbs developed goosebumps even in the middle of the afternoon. I found myself jumping at every little noise, the ticking of the kitchen clock, the subtle groan of the attic beams. My appetite dwindled, and my nights were plagued with half-formed nightmares. I saw corridors stretching endlessly, each one with a voice calling my name from within. I began feeling a strange pressure in certain rooms, as though I were being crowded by invisible onlookers. It was like standing in a jam-packed elevator, except I was alone, trapped in a confined space with no escape. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me. My breathing became tight, shallow, and labored, as if some unseen weight was pushing down on my chest. The sensation of being watched was now impossible to dismiss. Once, while brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror, I thought I saw a faint silhouette flicker behind me. But when I spun around, nothing was there. Adrenaline blasted through my system. My pulse hammered so fast that my vision flickered with spots of light. I couldn't breathe. Worse yet, the repeated calls were growing louder and more insistent. No longer did they simply ring out and fade, they now lingered, echoing like a drawn-out moan, almost a sob or a hiss that crawled under my skin. When I heard it next to my bed at dawn, so close that I felt hot breath on my ear, I tumbled out of the covers, hitting the floor. My heart pounded violently, as though trying to break free from my chest, sweat soaking my hairline. The voice had shifted. It was no longer a single tone, it sounded like multiple voices layered on top of each other, dissonant and sharp, creating a disharmony that made the hairs on my arms stand rigid. It repeated my name twice before retreating into silence, leaving me shivering in its wake. In my desperation, I decided I needed to figure out where exactly each call was coming from. To mark out a fully realized map of this spectral structure, I spent hours pacing the halls, watch in one hand and chalk in the other, drawing X-shaped marks on the walls and floor at every spot where I believed the voice had come from. Every 6 hours, it would happen. Each time, I would add another mark. Soon, the interior of my home was covered in chalk crosses, lines, and frantic notes scrawled in my handwriting. A strange labyrinth had emerged on my walls, each new mark connecting to the last, forming a map that eerily resembled the exact shape of the old prison's corridors. As the geometric pattern neared completion, the atmosphere in the house became oppressive, suffocating. The temperature fluctuated drastically. Sometimes an icy wind would gust through the living room, rattling the windows, only for the stifling heat to return moments later, making it difficult to breathe. My throat grew dry, and my skin became damp with perspiration. I could feel the air growing heavier, like it was pressing against me. My senses began to blur, as if the lines between what was real and what wasn't were starting to bend. The faint outlines I caught in my peripheral vision seemed sharper, more defined, as though shapes were stepping forward from the chalk markings, moving closer to me. More than once, I felt something brush against my shoulder or arm, a feather-light touch that made me jerk away in terror. But each time I spun around, there was nothing there. If there was something, I couldn't see it in any solid form. I tried speaking aloud, though it was rare, because speaking felt like breaking some unspoken rule. When I did, my voice sounded thin, uncertain, as if it didn't belong to me anymore. Something inside me was unraveling. But despite the fear, despite everything, I kept going. Because I had to understand. I had to know what was happening, why my reality was warping. I couldn't stop myself from drawing more lines, from tracing the map of the prison that seemed to be rewriting my life. I was no longer sure if I was living in my home or some twisted echo of it. The walls felt alive, the floor beneath me pulsed with an energy that didn't belong. And no matter how many chalk marks I made, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house, they, were waiting for something. Waiting for me to cross the line. Waiting for me to complete the final pattern. And when I did, whatever was waiting would finally return. I remember once demanding to be left alone, but the response was nothing but an oppressive silence. Another time, I whispered that I wasn't afraid. Yet the quake in my chest betrayed the lie. I believed that whatever was calling me was drawing power from my fear, feeding on my confusion. My dread soared when the next call came, a guttural, multi-layered voice that didn't just speak my name. It dragged the syllables out in a mocking, half-hissing tone. In the final phase, as the chalk diagram approached what I suspected was the last piece of the puzzle, I started to see flickers of movement in broad daylight. The outlines began gathering, coalescing into shapes that resembled twisted silhouettes, each one contorted in a posture of misery or rage. Panic crept into every muscle of my body. My legs trembled so severely that I had to lean against the wall to remain standing. My lungs burned from the shallow, frantic way I was breathing. I kept telling myself this couldn't be real. Yet my senses refused to give me any reprieve. Every nerve in my body was convinced the presence was tangible, pressing in on me from all sides. On the day the geometry was finally complete, I felt an almost electric sizzle in the air. It was as if the house vibrated with anticipation. A dark film seemed to coat the windows, blocking out the sunlight. The lights inside flickered uncontrollably, no matter which bulb I replaced. Shadows moved in corners where no objects existed to cast them. And then I heard it, a collective voice, a layered chorus reverberating from every direction, entrapping me in sound. It stretched my name into something that felt foreign. Each letter pulsed with its own sinister life. I fell to my knees, hands pressed tightly over my ears, trying desperately to shield myself from the deafening call. My heart hammered so hard it sent jolts down my arms, and I gasped for air as though I were drowning in the sound. I wanted to scream back, to shout for whatever this was to cease, to silence the chaos. But my throat locked, my vocal cords refusing to cooperate. In that all-consuming moment, my vision swarmed with pinpoints of darkness, as though the world around me was disintegrating. It felt as though something enormous and ancient was surging through the walls, collapsing the distance between realms, dragging that historical blueprint into the present. Then, just as my consciousness threatened to slip away, the noise cut off. My ears rang with the sudden silence, but the immediate onslaught receded. I crawled to my feet, my head spinning. I stumbled, like a drunk, unable to find my balance. The once lingering silhouettes had merged into a single patch of darkness in the center of the living room. It shifted and quivered, as though hundreds of restless shapes were fighting for dominance inside it. For a terrifying second, I believed it would take physical form, an amalgamation of all those tormented presences. But instead, it hovered there, a swirling void crackling with unseen energy. I wanted to run. My entire body screamed for me to flee, to escape the suffocating weight of that presence. Yet a compulsion rooted me to the spot, as though this mass of shadows had tethered itself to my name, and thus to me. My chest throbbed painfully, and I tasted copper on my tongue. Seconds stretched into an eternity as I stared at the dark vortex before me, an inverted shape that didn't reflect light but swallowed it whole. In the midst of that dread, a strange clarity blossomed in my mind. I realized that my presence had somehow enabled whatever lingering echo of that old prison existed in this space. The calls, the repeated utterance of my name, had anchored this collective consciousness here. And now that the blueprint was complete, it was on the verge of fully manifesting. I remembered reading something in the archives, about focusing the will, about refusing to give up the mental ground these entities needed to hold on. With my legs trembling, I concentrated on every ounce of defiance I had left. My heart pounded at a brutal pace, but I forced myself to think, to steady my breathing. You cannot have me. You are not stronger than me. I fought the overwhelming urge to let fear take over. Slowly, agonizingly, I managed to step back. Another step followed, then another, until I reached the threshold of the room. A low rumble emanated from the center of the living room. The swirling mass contracted, convulsing in place. I felt a pressure on my chest, an invisible force pushing me toward the center of the room. My eyes watered, and I clenched my fists, every hair on my body standing on end. I held on to that tiny seed of resolve, fueling it with each ragged breath. The pressure increased, the weight of it unbearable. I felt myself being drawn forward, inch by inch, as if the darkness itself was trying to claim me, to pull me into its abyss. The room seemed to distort, the walls closing in. But somehow, my resolve held. My steps were slow, but they were sure. And as I reached the door, the darkness recoiled, retreating just enough for me to escape. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew what was behind me. But whatever it was, it had not won. Not yet. I could practically feel the swirl of shapes testing my defenses, trying to siphon my fear, but I refused to yield. My chest burned with an unsteady combination of panic and determination. Without warning, the darkness fractured. A sharp screech ricocheted through the room, as if every voice that had shouted my name was now howling in unison. The temperature plummeted. I saw my own breath puff out in white plumes. Then, as quickly as the phenomenon had surged, it relented. The swirling black mass flickered once more, then collapsed in on itself like a dying star. A final drawn-out sigh reverberated in the air, and it was gone. I remained there unmoving, unable to process what had just transpired, until my trembling legs gave way and I sank to the floor. My heart was still racing, sweat plastered to my shirt, my back damp with terror. The chalk lines scrawled across my walls and floor were faintly visible, half erased by the sudden blast of energy that had whipped through the room. My body ached as though it had been physically pummeled. The heaviness in the atmosphere had eased, replaced now by a throbbing silence. My breathing was uneven, and although the pressing sense of doom had lifted, it was only marginally. In the hours that followed, I cautiously tested each room, stepping over the chalk markings, searching for any trace of that presence. I encountered nothing. No cold spots, no rancid odors, no flickers at the edge of my vision. The repeating voices were absent, and yet, unease lingered, digging its claws into the back of my mind. I couldn't tell if I was truly free of that collective consciousness or if I was simply being granted a reprieve. My name no longer echoed through the halls, but I found myself listening constantly, my heart skipping a beat at every rustle or creak. That night, I forced myself to sleep in my own bed, half expecting to hear the voice hiss my name in my ear at any moment. When morning finally broke without incident, I felt a cautious relief. Even so, I couldn't look at the chalk outlines on the walls without a surge of nausea and anxiety. Part of me wanted to scrub away every mark, every arrow, to purge the house of the geometry that had almost manifested a nightmare in my living room. Yet another part hesitated, terrified that disturbing the pattern might reignite the phenomenon. In the end, I slowly washed away each chalk line, my hands shaking with each wipe. My breath hitched whenever the old house groaned in the distance. I now live amid a fragile truce with whatever remains in these walls. I haven't heard my name called in weeks, and the silhouettes have not reappeared. Still, the hush that hangs over each room feels unnatural, like a held breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale. Sometimes, my stomach twists with dread at the thought that the collective consciousness might be biding its time, lurking below my perception, waiting for my guard to fall. Every so often, I'll catch a flicker of movement in a shadow, or sense a whisper that vanishes before I can fully register it. In those moments, my heart clenches, and the memory of that swirling dark mass floods my chest with raw panic. Perhaps I've sealed away the presence, for now. Or perhaps I've only taught it caution. I don't know. All I can do is try to maintain my grip on reality, keep my will strong, and resist the allure of fear. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that this land, my land, is steeped in old torment. Its echoes linger like half-heard cries in the night, reaching out for anyone who will heed them. I pray I never again hear my name in that terrible layered chorus. Yet, no matter how many candles I burn or how many lights I leave on, the house still feels watchful. I can never fully banish the sense that at any given moment, something just behind the walls is trying to recall that old geometry, waiting for me to falter. That uneasy truce is all I have now. I keep telling myself that I'm still here, still breathing, and that has to count for something. Still, when night falls, I sometimes lie awake, listening to the silence in my house. My heart pounds at the possibility that the next breath of wind might carry a voice that knows my name too well. A cold weight settled in my stomach the moment I stepped out of my car. The air around me was thick, a heavy silence that felt almost oppressive. The entire forest seemed to watch me with a predatory curiosity, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, observing my every move. It was an unsettling sensation, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had come to the woods with the intention of exploring, of immersing myself in nature for a few days, to escape the madness of my life. But from the moment I parked the car and stepped into the stillness of the forest, something felt wrong. The trees loomed taller than I remembered, their branches twisting in ways that made the shadows seem darker than they should have been. It felt as though something was out of place, something hidden, just beyond the reach of my senses. But I shrugged off the feeling. I had always believed that my mind was the only thing holding me back from fully embracing the wilderness. But that day, the forest was not the peaceful refuge I had hoped for. Instead, it seemed to be watching, waiting. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I could hear the rustle of leaves and the faint crunch of twigs beneath my feet. But it wasn't the sounds of nature that made me stop in my tracks. It was the silence that followed, the stillness that descended like a heavy fog. It was as if the forest itself had gone mute, holding its breath. Then I heard it, the faintest whisper, too quiet to make out. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining my ears. The forest around me was still, too still, and the whisper came again, closer this time. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, desperate. I took a hesitant step forward, but then stopped, a sudden sense of dread flooding over me. The air grew colder, and I could feel something pressing in on me from all sides. The trees seemed to shift, their branches moving in ways that weren't natural. I wasn't alone. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn around and flee. But the pull to continue was stronger, like the forest itself was calling me deeper into its heart. And despite every warning in my mind, I stepped forward, unable to resist the unseen force guiding me. A shiver crawled up my spine, and my breath caught in my throat before I could even unload my camping gear. Deep inside, I sensed something lurking in the shadows. A presence that made my muscles tighten and my heart pound as though it wanted to burst from my chest. Every sound became a warning, the crunch of gravel under my boots, the dull echo of a distant crow, the soft murmur of wind passing through pine needles. The campsite looked peaceful on the surface, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air that made me feel like I'd already crossed a line I couldn't retreat from. I had planned this weekend for solitude, hoping to clear my head from the mounting pressures of everyday life. I pitched my tent beneath a towering oak, its gnarled branches twisted like veins in a giant's arm, curling in all directions as though they were reaching for something. By the time I finished setting up, the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long, spidery shadows across the forest floor. The environment was quiet, too quiet. Not the peaceful hush I had hoped for, but a charged silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to brush it off, attributing my anxiety to the stress I had been under in recent weeks. But as dusk approached, the unease intensified. My heartbeats became shallow thuds, each pulse echoing in my ears. My throat felt tight, and I caught myself swallowing hard, trying to moisten a tongue gone bone dry. Without realizing it, I began to glance around anxiously, searching for a threat I couldn't define. When I finally noticed what was happening, I realized I was drenched in cold sweat. My shirt clung to my back, and a chill crept along my arms despite the mild temperature. Something about this place, or something within me, was wrong. That first night, I barely slept. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes flicking back and forth in the darkness, haunted by shapes that disappeared the moment I tried to focus. Every rustle of leaves beyond my tent made my pulse race. My breath turned shallow. I kept thinking I saw a figure in the corner of my vision or sensed a hand brushing against the fabric. I whispered to myself that it was only the wind, but deep down I knew that was a lie. Morning should have brought relief, but it didn't. With the early sunlight came an even deeper tension. I remember standing at the edge of a small lake, trying to force myself to enjoy the scenery. The surface was smooth, reflecting the pale sky with a mirror-like sheen. Despite the apparent tranquility, my stomach churned. It wasn't just anxiety anymore. It felt like my body was responding to a genuine threat. My skin prickled with goosebumps that wouldn't fade, and my mind whirled with nameless fears. That's when I first saw it, or sensed it. A dark mist floated at the periphery of my vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just tall pines standing still as sentinels. Yet, whenever I looked away, I felt its presence again. It was like a smudge on my sight that only revealed itself indirectly. My heart pounded even harder. I felt my chest tighten with panic, and a wave of nausea rushed through me as I tried to blink away the phantom darkness. The idea of losing my sanity gripped me. I wondered if I was having some sort of breakdown. Determined to confront whatever was happening, I pushed my fear aside and went back to my tent. All day, that inky shadow lingered in the corner of my vision, pulsing with an energy that wrapped cold tendrils around my mind. By sunset, I was shaking so badly I could hardly build a fire. My hands trembled as if I'd been locked in a freezer for hours. When I finally lit the flames, I sat there, numb and overwhelmed, watching the night sky grow darker and darker. That was when I realized my senses had sharpened in a profoundly unsettling way. I could pick up on the emotional states of animals scurrying in the undergrowth. The tiny rustle of a squirrel, the subtle shift of a deer's hooves, all of it felt amplified, like I could feel the pulse of each living thing. But there was something more. The animals seemed to be reacting to me. Their fear was palpable, a shared awareness of something wrong. I could feel the distance between us shrinking, as though I were becoming part of their world in a way that was unnatural. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the faintest scent of something decayed, something long forgotten. I stood up, my heart thumping loudly in my chest as the air around me felt charged. Something was closing in on the very heart of this forest. I was no longer just a visitor. I was part of something larger, something ancient, and it was growing restless. And then it hit me. The sound that had been following me, growing in intensity, had a rhythm. Not a natural rhythm, but something deliberate, something controlled. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rustle of leaves. It was the sound of steps, measured and methodical, coming from all directions. No longer an isolated phenomenon, now it was everywhere, surrounding me. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath turned to mist, mingling with the air that felt alive with unseen eyes. The ground beneath me seemed to hum, vibrating with the steps of something approaching, something massive, hidden beneath the earth. The forest was no longer still. It was waiting for something. And I, foolishly, had walked right into it. My feet moved without my consent, drawing me deeper into the woods, towards something ancient that had been disturbed by my presence. It wasn't the forest that was alive, it was the thing beneath it, the thing that had been here long before humans. And now, it had noticed me. Their tiny heartbeats and flickers of fear and curiosity floated around me like glowing motes, which I could sense as shapes or pulses in the air. My breath caught in my chest as I realized it wasn't normal to see emotions like this. Then I recalled the dark mist that haunted my vision. Maybe that was a manifestation of my own terror. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something outside of me. By the time the sky was fully black, I had the distinct impression that the darkness wasn't just around me. It was within me, linking me to this alien presence I couldn't explain. I could almost hear a sickly hum or vibration behind my ears, as if something was tuning into my fear frequency, amplifying it. My legs grew weak, and I dropped to my knees beside the fire. I felt drenched in cold sweat again, my heart battering my rib cage with ferocity. Every exhale seemed to carry a whimper of dread. I can't recall how I made it through the night without sprinting into the woods in blind panic. The next morning, I broke camp and left, convinced that I was escaping a nightmare. The drive home felt endless. My entire body remained tense, and my eyes kept darting to the edges of the road, worried I'd see that dark smudge drifting among the trees. Once I reached my driveway, relief flooded me. I was back in a familiar environment, far from that cursed campsite. But comfort never arrived. Soon after my return, I started sensing more emotional auras around people. If someone nearby was anxious, I'd see it as a pulsating gray glow. If someone was angry, a deep red flicker danced like embers on a breeze. The strangest part was that I also felt a link to them, an awareness so profound it left me shaky and unsettled. It was as if my own fear had opened a door that I couldn't close. Then I saw that same dark mist drifting down my hallway late at night. The shape was no longer relegated to my peripheral vision. It glided with a slow, predatory grace, curling in on itself as though feeding on the air. My heart pounded so violently that my chest ached. My limbs felt heavy and useless, as though I were caught in a tar pit. That night, I barely slept again. Each time I managed to close my eyes, I jolted awake in cold sweat. Over the following days, I watched in growing horror as people around me began exhibiting extreme phobias. My neighbor, who had always been fearless about the dark, now refused to switch off his porch light. Another friend, who had never feared the night, repeatedly expressed a paralyzing dread of open windows, barricading them every evening. They had never shown these fears before. It struck me that the same terror that plagued me had begun leaking into others, spreading like a virus. I could perceive the intangible threads connecting us, a kind of psychic fungal network that thrived on dread. I spotted it in the subtle changes of posture, the new lines etched into their foreheads, the wide, haunted eyes that refused to meet mine. I came to understand that the dark mist was more than a hallucination. It was an entity, a parasitic being that fed on human fear. It had tasted my terror at the campsite, and now it followed me, using me like a carrier to infect those around me. Each new host displayed a sudden surge of irrational phobias, as if their primal fear centers were plugged into some invisible pipeline. When they were near me, I saw faint tendrils of black root-like projections spreading from my body to theirs. These threads were intangible, yet I sensed them with every fiber of my being. Trying to isolate myself seemed the only logical solution. I stopped going to gatherings, avoided eye contact, and locked myself in my apartment for days. My phone vibrated constantly with messages, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I feared that even through technology, this thing might creep into someone else's mind. My heart raced whenever I thought about the possibility that more people would suffer the same soul-crushing terror I felt. The dryness in my mouth became constant, and my palms perpetually dripped with sweat. The entity had found me. And now, it was spreading. My hands trembled so badly that simple tasks like cooking or typing took double the effort. At night, the mist coiled in the corners of my home, slithering along the baseboards, creeping closer as if savoring the mounting fear radiating off me. One evening, while trying desperately to distract myself by watching a movie, I caught sight of the black tendril stretching across the ceiling. My entire body seized with panic. My heartbeat hammered against my eardrums, and I gasped for breath like a drowning swimmer. The edges of my vision blurred. I nearly fainted, cold sweat dripping down my forehead. Somehow, I forced myself to focus on steady breathing until the wave of dread subsided, but the relief was always short-lived. The parasitic entity was never far. I began to sense it spread more acutely around my building. I overheard someone in the hallway mentioning that another resident had developed a sudden panic of flushing toilets of all things. A friend texted me, recounting a vivid nightmare about being trapped in an elevator. They had never had claustrophobia before, but their messages were laced with terrified confusion, and the guilt in my chest grew heavier by the hour. I tried to investigate my predicament by researching obscure psychological conditions and paranormal phenomena. My vision blurred after hours of scrolling through forums and unreadable articles. I found an old reference to a concept describing fear as an energy that certain entities consume. It was called emotional mycelium, a hidden fungal network that linked one terrified mind to another, allowing the parasite to feed on the collective dread. My eyes stung from sleeplessness, and my heart pounded with each new piece of information. My breath came out in uneven, ragged bursts. I felt no closer to a solution, only more aware that I was trapped in something massive and horrifying. One night, I could bear it no longer. I decided to confront the thing directly. My plan was half-formed and desperate. If I could somehow separate my emotions from the creature's feeding channels, maybe I could starve it. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and forced myself to remain calm, picturing my fear as a tangible resource I could withhold. The darkness was absolute. Almost immediately, I felt its presence swarm around me, as if excited by my vulnerability. My pulse raced, but I tried to suppress my panic, breathing deliberately to keep my heart rate from spiraling. I stood in the center of my living room, every muscle clenched. My teeth chattered with raw terror. My palms were slick, and my shirt stuck to my torso. But somehow, in that moment, I visualized a barrier around my thoughts. When I felt the dark tendrils slither against my psyche, I imagined them hitting a solid wall and recoiling. Sweat poured down my temples, and my vision flickered with faint spots of color. Yet, I continued to push the terror away, refusing to let it grow. Gradually, the sense of suffocation eased. The air around me felt lighter. I opened my eyes. I saw the mist retreat, shrinking into a corner of the room, as if I had become distasteful to it. My body trembled like a leaf in a storm, and the exertion left me dizzy. For the first time since the camping trip, I felt an ounce of power over my circumstances. Though the creature didn't vanish entirely, I sensed a subtle shift in its strength, as if some vital cord had been cut. Over the next days, I learned to repeat that meditative state, denying the parasite the feast it desired. I could still feel it hovering at the edges of my awareness, waiting for me to slip back into despair and panic. But I held on, cultivating a cold, focused calm whenever I felt the beginnings of fear rising in my chest. Friends reported less frequent bouts of irrational phobias, and the oppressive tension in my surroundings eased, though it never fully disappeared. I realized that my connection to the entity remained, an unwelcome tether that could tighten at any moment. Part of me knew it was biding its time, content to lurk until I weakened, or someone else nearby took in enough terror to feed it again. Even so, I managed to return to a semblance of normal life. But I couldn't ignore the fact that the entity was still out there, waiting, feeding, watching. I left my apartment more often, slowly regaining some sense of control. But that final revelation, that this thing was out there, thriving on our darkest dreads, never left me. Sometimes late at night, I still catch a glimpse of that dark mist drifting by a window or curling under a door. My heart will stutter, my breath will catch, and I'll feel droplets of cold sweat beating on my forehead. Yet, I've learned to push it away, keeping my fear on a tight leash. I've accepted that my life will never be the same. There is a parasite feeding on terror, an invisible mycelium connecting us through our shared vulnerabilities. It followed me home from the woods, built a network of fear, and tried to devour every ounce of security I once knew. I might have gained a fragile control, but the real horror is the knowledge that it can't be destroyed, only contained. Every time I close my eyes, I brace myself against the possibility that I'll open them to find it looming before me, drifting in the darkness, hungry. And that knowledge, more than anything, ensures I'll never truly rest again. I felt an odd unease the first time I stepped into that apartment. I remember how the hallway light seemed to flicker right as I turned the key in the lock, and the heaviness in the air made my chest feel tight. Something about the place just seemed wrong. But I brushed it off as nerves about moving. Now, looking back, I realized that unsettling sensation wasn't just a trick of my imagination. It was a warning, and I ignored it. I moved into this building, an old structure that had supposedly been remodeled many times because the rent was cheap and the location convenient. It had a grand facade with gargoyles perched along the roof, crumbling walls, and tall, narrow windows that let in little light. People in the neighborhood had told me the building was known for having a complicated history, but they never gave me details. My first few nights were nothing unusual, though they felt strangely quiet, as if the floors and walls were holding their breath. I told myself I was just acclimating to a new environment. Yet, a sense of unease settled in my bones, making me restless. I could hear the old pipes groan in the distance sometimes, as if something alive was traveling through them. When I finally decided to take a long, hot shower to release the tension in my muscles, I discovered the first sign that my new home was a place of secrets. The moment I turned on the shower, my ears picked up an unsettling murmur. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just the sound of water hitting the tiles. But as I rinsed the shampoo out of my hair, the murmuring turned into distinct whispers. My heart hammered against my rib cage, and my pulse fluttered in my neck. I remember standing there, soap in my eyes, unsure if I was actually hearing voices. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I nearly slipped on the wet tiles. I clenched my teeth, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was like a crowd of people speaking just below the surface of the water, pressing their voices through the rushing torrent. Every hair on my body prickled, and I fumbled to shut off the faucet. But the voices continued for a few seconds even after the water stopped, then abruptly went silent. I pressed my ear against the tiled wall, my wet skin leaving a cold imprint, but I heard nothing. My heart still drummed and my breaths came short and sharp as I tried to collect myself. The next few days, I tried to rationalize what I had experienced. Maybe the pipes were old and produced strange echoes. Perhaps the water pressure changes created a whistling that mimicked speech. I told myself that new surroundings often play tricks on a stressed mind. But as soon as I turned the shower back on, the faint whispering returned, always just at the edge of my hearing. The voices seemed to rise and fall with the flow of water, as if they were feeding off it. They whispered words I couldn't make out, but I felt a piercing dread each time they spoke. The water started to carry more than just heat and moisture into the air. It carried a presence. On the fifth day, I called a friend of mine and described in halting sentences what I had been experiencing. She listened carefully but was skeptical, offering logical explanations about plumbing or the acoustics in old buildings. But I could hear the unease in her voice as I described the whispered voices and the chill that ran through me each time they came. When I ended the call, I felt more alone than ever. And when I returned to the shower that evening, I knew the voices would be waiting for me. He offered the usual reassurances that maybe it was just the building's ancient plumbing. He suggested I play loud music while showering to mask the sound. I tried that, but it made no difference. Through the blare of music, I could still discern those insidious whispers, faint, but insistent. My friend could tell I was shaken, even though I tried to sound casual, and he recommended I talk to the building's superintendent. I went to the superintendent's office, a cramped space in the basement. I explained that I heard odd sounds in the water pipes, almost like voices. He looked at me with an inscrutable expression, then said maybe the pipes were clogged and that he'd send someone to check. I left feeling uneasy. Something in his eyes hinted that he knew more than he was letting on. The entire conversation felt like an evasion. That same evening, I noticed another strange phenomenon. The water in my kitchen sink trickled out at an odd angle, as if defying gravity for a split second. I turned the faucet on and off. Baffled by the droplets that seemed to hover midair before plummeting into the basin, my hands shook as I reached into the stream, and a biting cold surged through my fingertips. The temperature shouldn't have been so low if I'd set it to warm. Yet, the water felt unnaturally frigid, leaving behind a tingling sensation like static electricity. Within a week, the activity escalated. Taking a shower became more than just an auditory nightmare. The water itself started forming swirling, spiraling patterns on the bathtub floor as if guided by an unseen hand. My skin would prickle and my stomach knotted with each swirl, as if I were inches away from a terrible secret. I began to keep the lights on everywhere in the apartment, even though I knew it wouldn't stop the phenomenon. It was a flimsy shield against the dread crawling through my thoughts. Nighttime brought new horrors. I often woke up drenched in sweat, uncertain if the sounds I heard were real. Soft scraping noises, as if nails were tapping along the pipes inside the walls, followed by an almost melodic gurgle of water. On one particularly disturbed night, I left my bedroom to get a drink of water, only to find the faucet turned on by itself. The water shot from the tap in a thin, pointed stream and curved upward before splashing against the steel basin. I swear it was defying physics right in front of me. My throat constricted, my breath ragged, as if I couldn't pull enough oxygen into my lungs. When I finally mustered the courage to twist the knob, the water shut off, leaving me to stare at the drip, drip, drip echoing ominously in the sink. The following morning, I was brushing my teeth when I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. The shower curtain behind me was closed, but I noticed a dark shifting silhouette. I turned around slowly, sweat breaking out along my forehead, heart thundering in my chest. The shower curtain fluttered slightly, as if disturbed by a gust of wind, yet the bathroom window was sealed shut. Summoning all my nerve, I yanked the curtain open. The tub was empty, but the surface of the water droplets around the drain seemed to quake like it was trembling with a life of its own. Suddenly, I felt an intense chill that worked its way up my spine, and I bolted from the room. By this point, my sense of reality started to fray. Every time I heard the old pipes groan, I expected to hear those voices seep in. I could almost discern words sometimes, pleas for help or accusations. My neck muscles were constantly tense, my palms clammy. I was exhausted but too afraid to sleep deeply. The fear of letting my guard down haunted me. My mind circled back to questions I couldn't answer. Why did the water behave so strangely? Who did those voices belong to? And what if I was simply losing my mind? Then I began to research the history of the building, combing through local archives. I discovered that this was once the site of an old estate. Rumor had it the original owner was obsessed with the idea of reaching a parallel world he believed lay just beyond the water's surface. Some stories suggested he had used the house's water system to conduct bizarre experiments. But the accounts were vague. Nobody mentioned children or families, just rumors of tenants disappearing, though no conclusive records showed any official missing persons cases. Still, I felt a profound sense of unease reading about it. The more I dug, the more I uncovered a pattern of abrupt vacancies over the decades, always involving the top floors where my apartment now stood. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I confronted the superintendent again. This time, I demanded an explanation for the strange occurrences. He just stared at me, his eyes flickering with what looked like guilt. After a lengthy pause, he admitted in hushed tones with his gaze averted that the building had a peculiar connection to what he called an aquatic portal. He never explained the origin of that phrase, only that the pipe sometimes acted as a bridge between this plane and another, a watery dimension where lost souls were said to be trapped. He claimed it was all legend, but his trembling voice betrayed him. Over the following days, the water in my apartment exhibited even more bizarre traits. At times, it flowed upward from the sink, forming swirling coils in midair before dropping. In the shower, it solidified momentarily into partial shapes. Misshapen arms or half-formed faces that vanished the instant I blinked. My heart pounded so fiercely at these sightings that I often staggered out of the bathroom, gasping. My entire body would tremble, sweat pouring down my temples, as if I had narrowly escaped some predatory force. Every night, I felt as if dozens of eyes were fixed on me through the walls. Once, as I passed by the bathroom in the dim corridor light, I glimpsed a tall, watery silhouette standing behind the shower curtain, swaying with fluid grace. It dissolved when I mustered the courage to turn on the light. But a lingering dampness remained on the floor, forming swirling patterns around my feet that receded too quickly into the drain. My sense of panic escalated daily, and I could barely focus on work or even basic chores. Eating felt impossible. My throat was constantly tight, and any attempt at a full meal was met with nausea. One evening, I dared to turn on the shower with the intention of confronting whatever lurked within. The second the water began to rush, the voices erupted, filling the bathroom with a low chorus of moans, whispers, and frantic pleas. Their tone wavered between desperation and rage. I felt my breathing turn shallow, my heart thudding so violently it hurt. My vision blurred as steam rose, thick and suffocating, transforming the small space into a haze of humid dread. I could sense shapes moving in the corner of my vision, formed by the steam itself, ghostly forms with fluid edges. My stomach churned, and I clutched the sink to steady myself. In that moment, I understood they were not just random spirits. They were ex-residents trapped in a liminal space, caught between worlds. Their presence was strongest in the shower, a direct conduit to the watery dimension. I remembered the old stories about experiments in this house, about portals and lost tenants. Fear twisted in my gut like a knife, and I felt an overwhelming urge to get out. Yet, I couldn't move. I heard them, not as clear voices, but as a collective pulse in my mind. They demanded release, or at least recognition. Suddenly, the water surged upward from the drain, lapping against my ankles, climbing in defiance of gravity. My teeth chattered as frigid water engulfed my legs. The shapes in the steam drifted closer, and I felt like I was being drawn in. My breath caught, and a dizziness overtook me as the water clung to my skin. In that delirious haze, I had a flash of clarity. Maybe I could turn off the main valve in the apartment. If there was no water, no portal would remain. Summoning every scrap of willpower, I lunged for the handle and wrenched the shower off. The water receded instantly, and the bathroom was plunged into a tense silence, save for the rapid pounding of my heartbeat. My limbs trembled as I managed to shut off the main water supply. I spent the rest of the night sitting against the bathroom door, forcing myself not to turn the water back on, listening to the building's ancient pipes gurgle and hiss in protest. The next day, I called a professional plumber, but when he arrived, he just gave me a skeptical look. Still, he replaced a few pipes and insisted everything was working. Yet, the water remained shut off, and I resisted the urge to test it. By the second day, with no water, I realized I needed a permanent solution, or I'd be forced to leave the apartment entirely. The tension in the air felt almost alive, as if the building resented my defiance. At times I heard faint moans from the pipes, like they were hungry. Desperation fueled my resolve. I barricaded the drains in every sink and the tub with heavy towels and plastic sheeting. Then I went downstairs and explained to the superintendent that I would be moving out if this wasn't resolved. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. Quietly, he disclosed a final detail. The building was constructed on top of what some old records called a water gate, an ancient aquatic portal. To those who listened too closely or turned on the taps too often, this gateway would reveal itself. Though terror squeezed my stomach, I demanded that he help me seal whatever opening existed. His answer was a vague set of directions involving blocking certain pipes in the basement at midnight. A procedure that sounded like more folklore than fact, but I tried it anyway, creeping through the damp, poorly lit basement with tools in hand. My skin crawled with every drop of condensation trickling from overhead pipes. The place smelled of mildew, and the gloom felt suffocating. But a new determination had replaced some of my fear. Following the instructions, I found several old valves connected to a series of thick, corroded pipes. I turned them shut, twisting until my hands ached. The clang of metal reverberated through the basement corridors, sending echoes that felt almost like screams. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst, and sweat trickled down my temples despite the cold air. At the moment I sealed the last valve, a massive rush of water roared within the pipe as if something on the other side was fighting back. My breath caught in my throat. Then the noise subsided, and an oppressive silence replaced it. My arms trembled, but I held firm. When I climbed back up to my apartment, the atmosphere felt lighter, as if a dense fog had lifted. Over the next hour, I tested the water. It trickled from the faucet as a normal stream with no unusual behavior. My relief was so great that my knees buckled and I sank onto the floor, chest heaving with long, shaky breaths. My entire body quivered, drained from weeks of relentless fear. But I felt like I had severed a malignant link. I stayed in the apartment another 2 days, too shaken to trust that the threat was truly gone. Yet not once did I hear the voices. The water remained obedient to gravity. There were no shapes in the steam, no bizarre humming in the walls. The building itself felt different, less hostile. Eventually, I made the decision to leave. Though the phenomena had ceased, I couldn't stomach the idea of living in a place perched on the edge of a dimension where lost souls lingered. As I locked up for the last time, I heard a faint dripping from the bathroom. I froze, my heart lurching. A dread-laced prickle crawled up my spine. Stepping inside, I noticed the faucet was dripping one solitary drop at a time. It echoed loudly in the quiet. I turned the knob to tighten it and the drip stopped. For a moment, I thought I heard the distant murmur of voices, but it was so faint it could have been my imagination. My chest felt tight, and I exhaled a shaky breath. Gathering my final belongings, I left the apartment with an unsettling certainty. I might have managed to close the door to that watery realm, but the building remained perched over that ancient gateway, and its thirst for new victims might never be fully sated. Outside, under the pale morning light, I felt an odd mixture of relief and lingering terror. I told myself I was safe, that I had overcome something impossible. But the faint sound of dripping water in the back of my mind continues to haunt me, reminding me that some doors, once discovered, can never be entirely locked. I've stayed away from that building. Yet, even now, whenever I step into a shower or hear water running through pipes, my skin prickles, my heart races, and my mouth goes dry. My mind replays every horrifying detail, every swollen droplet that rose against gravity, every ghostly shape that hovered behind the shower curtain. Sometimes in my deepest moments of doubt, I wonder if I did indeed seal that portal, or if it simply bides its time, waiting for someone less wary to open the taps. And that thought lingers like a cold hand on my shoulder, reminding me that some horrors are too vast to truly escape. I remember the first time I felt something watching me, even before I saw the horned figure dancing in the shadows. It was a suffocating heaviness in the air, an almost physical pressure that made it difficult to swallow, as though an invisible pair of hands were tightening around my throat. My pulse pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. And every muscle in my body braced for a threat that had no name. I stood there in my dimly lit studio, paintbrush in hand, staring at a blank canvas, convinced I was not alone. The feeling was unsettling but diffuse, like hearing a whisper in a language you don't understand. It was a fleeting moment, but it stained my thoughts long after I left the easel. That was the beginning of my descent into the most disorienting chapter of my life. My studio is a single-room loft with a high ceiling and tall windows that let in the city's sickly orange glow at night. Each corner is cluttered with half-finished canvases, paint-stained rags, and sculptures in various stages of completion. The overhead fluorescent lights flicker sporadically, creating staccato bursts of brightness that make me feel as if I'm under interrogation. When the flicker coincides with complete silence, it's as if the world briefly halts, and I'm stranded alone in a moment outside of time. A week after that initial sense of being watched, I was working late, bent over a new canvas. My only illumination came from a single desk lamp casting harsh shadows across my workspace. My back ached from hunching over the easel, but inspiration had struck, and I refused to let the moment slip away. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. It wasn't the usual flicker of my faulty overhead light. It was something more organic, something with shape and substance. I looked up and saw, near a stack of old canvases leaning against the wall, a silhouette about the size of a cat. It was darker than the surrounding gloom, like a concentration of blackness that made the rest of the shadows seem pale in comparison. The shape had horns, two curved protrusions that caught the faint glow of the lamp, and it seemed to pulse like living smoke. A wave of cold air passed through me, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. My lungs seized, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. My heart kicked into a staccato rhythm, adrenaline surging through my veins. By the time I managed to blink, the figure was gone. Yet the impression it left on my retinas lingered like a photographic afterimage. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a side effect of fatigue and too much coffee. But the cold feeling in my chest, the clammy sweat coating my palms, told me something was wrong. The stirring in my gut whispered that I had brushed up against something profoundly unsettling, something that had no place in my familiar paint-splattered world. Over the following days, I saw it again. Always at the edges of my vision, always half buried in the shadows, it moved silently with a fluidity that reminded me of smoke carried by a gentle draft. My paintbrush would slip from my fingers, or I would lose my train of thought whenever it appeared. At first, I tried to dismiss it as stress-induced hallucinations, but the persistent sense of a presence wouldn't let me rest. It was in the subtle changes in the atmosphere of the studio. The air tasted metallic. My ears picked up faint scuttling sounds when I was certain I was alone. And the overhead fluorescents would buzz in an odd syncopated rhythm, like they were flickering in time with some hidden heartbeat. I started painting to exercise my anxieties, hoping that by pouring them onto the canvas, I could reclaim my sanity. I created abstract shapes and dark colors, swirling them together to form chaotic patterns. I found a certain catharsis in those aggressive brush strokes. Each slash of color an attempt to purge that eerie presence from my thoughts. Yet something in the final product began to unsettle me. Hidden in the patterns and textures, I noticed shapes that resembled that horned creature. I would step back to admire my progress, only to spot a faint silhouette curling within the paint. Where my original intent had been purely expressionistic, these unsettling forms felt inserted by an external hand. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was simply projecting my paranoia onto the canvas. But friends who visited my studio mentioned that the new paintings felt disquieting, as if something in the pigments disturbed them on a subconscious level. One patron who commissioned a piece later contacted me to say that the artwork made them uneasy. They described recurring nightmares that started the night they brought the canvas home. In these dreams, they saw an inky figure lurking in dark corners, waiting for them to fall asleep. They thought it was a coincidence, but their voice trembled when they shared the story, and they insisted they had never experienced dreams like that before. Little by little, more clients reported similar experiences. Some refused to come out and say it directly, but they hinted that something about my creations had begun to affect them in unsettling ways. They spoke of hearing strange noises in the room where the artwork was displayed. They reported a creeping sense of being watched and fleeting glimpses of a shape that vanished the instant they tried to focus on it. One particularly skittish client left a frantic message telling me they had woken to find the painting slightly askew on the wall, although they lived alone and rarely had visitors. According to them, the background colors of the painting seemed to shift each time they blinked. When they tried to remove it from their home, an inexplicable fear seized them, and they found themselves too terrified to touch it, as though the piece exuded a repulsive aura. Listening to these accounts made my heart pound relentlessly against my ribs. I felt trapped between fear and curiosity. I began to see patterns in my nightmares that echoed the stories I was hearing. The horned silhouette in the periphery, the sense of something intangible creeping closer. My anxiety manifested in physical symptoms. My hands trembled as I picked up a brush. Sweat gathered cold and slick under my arms. And my pulse was in a constant race with my imagination. Day after day, the boundary between my art and my reality blurred further. It was like the entity was using my creativity as a conduit, slipping into each piece without my conscious approval. During one particularly oppressive night, I sat in my studio, lights dimmed, trying to work on a new project. A rancid smell wafted through the room, sour and moldy, and it struck me so strongly that I gagged. My eyes watered and I glanced around to see if maybe a piece of fruit had rotted or a damp rag had been left in a corner. As I rose to check, I spotted the figure again, this time more distinct than ever. Its body coiled like twisting smoke, but its horns seemed solid, protruding from its small, hunched form. It advanced a fraction of an inch, and I felt a sudden chill embrace me. My breath caught in my throat and I broke into a clammy sweat. The figure stared at me. Though it had no visible eyes, I felt its scrutiny as clearly as a hot brand. I tried to speak, but my mouth was so dry my tongue felt like sandpaper. The only sound that emerged was a trembling exhalation. Then, in a fluid, impossible motion, it swirled around the base of my canvas. I watched in horrified fascination as wisps of black mist seemed to meld with the wet paint, forming a subtle, near-invisible mark on the surface. The second it merged with the painting, the rancid smell vanished, replaced by the faint odor of ozone, as though lightning had just struck inside the studio. I practically tore the canvas from the easel and hid it behind a stack of older works, hoping out of sight would mean out of mind. But the memory lingered. My mind reeled with questions. Had I gone mad? Was I hallucinating? Or was there something ancient and malevolent weaving itself into my art? Over the next weeks, I researched esoteric art histories and obscure mythologies. I found references to ancient cultures that believed spirits could inhabit objects, idols, sculptures, paintings, turning them into gateways for hidden deities to exert influence over the mortal realm. One text mentioned a particularly obscure sect devoted to an entity sometimes depicted with small horns and a smoky form said to thrive on creative energy. The more I read, the deeper the chill in my bones grew. My pulse rate seemed permanently elevated, and I felt a constant flutter in my stomach, as if I were teetering on the brink of a revelation I wasn't prepared to handle. I recalled the messages from my patrons, the shared nightmares and common visions. It wasn't just me. This entity or deity or whatever it was broadcasting its presence through my pieces, influencing anyone who acquired them. Every sale, every client who proudly displayed my work unwittingly invited this thing into their homes. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I doubled over, gasping for air, sweat beading on my forehead. My eyes burned with unshed tears of dread and guilt. Had I become a vessel for something far beyond my understanding? I tried to stop painting, but it was as if an unnatural compulsion overtook me. My hands twitched with the need to create, to apply paint in fluid motions, to bring shape to the swirling images in my mind. Each time I gave in, the horned figure would appear again at the edges of my vision, nudging me to include its likeness in my work in increasingly subtle ways. Sometimes it was a faint curve in the background, other times a swirl of dark shadow that almost formed a silhouette. My nails bit into my palms as I wrestled with the compulsion, but it was no use. The entity's influence was potent and all-consuming when I attempted to speak with a confidant, an old acquaintance who once studied the occult. He told me indirectly that I needed to destroy the pieces. He didn't come right out and say it, but his manner was urgent. His voice quivered as he described the dangers of idolatry and the risk of attracting attention from predatory spirits. He asked if I'd felt changes in my physical environment, like sudden drops in temperature or strange electrical surges. I confirmed everything, and that stoked his fear. He implied that the only way to stop the entity's spread was to sever its link to our world by eradicating its mediums, in this case, my artworks. But the more he spoke, the more I felt a clamp tighten around my heart. The idea of destroying what I had created felt both horrifying and impossible. I made an attempt one night, steeling myself to tear down my canvases and throw them into a metal bin I kept for scraps. My hands shook violently, and the sense of dread was so palpable I could barely breathe. I felt that if I took one step closer to the painting, something in the atmosphere would snap. As I reached for the canvas, I heard a scraping sound as if claws were dragging across the concrete floor. My vision blurred and my stomach churned. I dropped to my knees, consumed by raw, choking fear. It felt as though the space around me distorted, pressing in on my chest so I couldn't inhale without wheezing. In that moment, I became convinced the entity would do more than just prevent me from destroying the piece. It would consume every ounce of my sanity if I tried. Eventually, I abandoned that approach and slumped onto the floor, panting and soaked in cold sweat. My heart pounded like a war drum, and all I could do was stare blankly at the painting that seemed to gaze back at me. I can't seem to shake the feeling that I'm still being watched, even from a distance. The weight of that presence has become a constant hum in the background of my life, like a warning bell that rings faintly, just beneath the surface. There are days when I can almost feel it reaching out to me again, waiting for a weak moment, an opportunity to slip back into my mind, my art, my very soul. It's been weeks since I moved into my new apartment. The daylight feels different here, brighter, like it's somehow more substantial, a tangible force that shields me from the darkness. The air, too, feels more natural, there's no oppressive, suffocating weight pressing in from every direction. The nights are quieter. At least, for the most part. But the echoes linger. I've told myself that leaving was the right thing to do, that I've escaped. But there's always that voice in the back of my mind, whispers that hint at the fact that the work I've left behind is still alive, still watching, still waiting to break free. That dark force, that horned figure that appeared in the edges of my vision, is a reminder that once it attaches itself to something, especially something as sacred as creativity, it never truly lets go. I try not to think about it, but I can't help it. Every time I look at my reflection in the mirror, I find myself searching for the shadows that shouldn't be there, for the hints of dark shapes creeping into my peripheral vision. Every time the air shifts, every time a distant sound catches my attention, my body reacts with a primal tension, a flicker of fear, a reminder that I'm never truly alone. The door I closed behind me was never truly locked. I know this. I feel it. Maybe it's the price I pay for letting something like that into my life. For giving in to the urge to create, to capture what lies within the deepest recesses of my mind. And now that it's been done, I have to live with the consequences. The canvas, the paint, the art, those were only the mediums, the conduits. It was my will, my soul that let it all in. And now, the feeling that it is out there, waiting, is a burden I must carry. I can only hope that my attempt to sever the link was enough. But deep down, I know better. I know that the pieces of my past work still exist. They still haunt the corners of my former life, scattered through homes and galleries, still drawing that malevolent energy to anyone who gazes upon them. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The shadows, the whispers, and the looming figures, they're always waiting, always creeping, always watching. And for as long as I create, I know that they will follow. The air grew thick as I strained to listen. The voice, my name, hovered in the stale, musty air, almost too faint to hear but unmistakable in its cadence. My pulse quickened again, and for the briefest moment, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, as though rooted to the floor by some unseen force. I took a deep, shuddering breath, hoping to regain some semblance of control, but my mind was reeling. What was happening? Was I losing my grip on reality, or was something else at work here? I glanced over my shoulder nervously, but all I saw was the sterile, dimly lit basement corridor stretching endlessly behind me. The whispers of my name were distant, yet undeniably real. They came from everywhere, nowhere, and everywhere again, leaving me to question the very nature of what I was experiencing. I forced myself to move forward, my legs shaky but determined to get out of the suffocating space. I hurried back to the elevator, my heart pounding in my chest, and pressed the button to ascend. But as the elevator door closed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, the faintest reflection in the stainless steel doors, something just out of reach in the shadows. A figure. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, staring at the image in the glass. It was distorted, fleeting, like a smear of darkness, but unmistakable. A shape that resembled someone standing just behind me. Someone I couldn't see, yet felt. The elevator jerked upward with an unsettling slowness, and I forced my gaze to the wall, fighting the instinct to look back. The figure in the reflection grew more defined, the presence more tangible. When the elevator finally reached my floor, I rushed out, practically stumbling into the hallway. The office around me felt different, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. My breath was shallow, my skin clammy as I tried to regain control over my racing heart. I reached my desk, hands trembling, and sat down, trying to steady myself. The room was silent, too silent. I glanced at the monitor, hoping the normalcy of work would help ground me, but the screen flickered. The image distorted again. For a split second, I saw something, or someone, move in the corner of the monitor. It was me, sitting at the desk, but my reflection in the screen was wrong. My face was twisted into a silent scream, eyes wide with terror. I blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. But my heart thudded painfully in my chest, as though it was fighting against something. Something inside me, something dark and consuming. A sense of déjà vu washed over me, and for a moment, I thought I was drowning in it. It took everything in me not to look back. Not to turn around and see what was waiting behind me. I was no longer sure what was real. The room around me seemed to warp, the edges of the walls bleeding into a haze, as I stared at the figure on the phone screen. It was like looking into a reflection that had shifted, something otherworldly, twisted in its resemblance to me. My heart thudded harder, my breath becoming ragged, as if that gaze was somehow reaching across the void to touch my very soul. The figure in the video didn't move, but I could feel the weight of his presence growing heavier, almost as if he were pulling me toward him. His eyes, empty and hollow, seemed to peer into the very core of my being. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing as the screen flashed once again, this time filling with static before cutting out entirely. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight in the air intensified, and for a moment, I wondered if I had somehow crossed into another world entirely, if I had somehow slipped through a crack in reality. I stood frozen, staring at the phone in my hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread seep into my bones. The familiar hum of the building's air conditioning seemed muted now, as if even the building itself were holding its breath. The phone vibrated again. I hesitated for a long moment, my finger hovering over the screen. I knew what I would find. I knew it would be the same distorted reflection of myself, or worse, something far darker and more incomprehensible. But curiosity, that dangerous, insistent force, pushed me to accept the call. The screen flickered before it revealed the same familiar office space, except this time, it was different. It was mine, yet it wasn't. The shadows were wrong, and the air seemed thicker, more oppressive. The colors were washed out, giving everything an eerie, otherworldly quality. And then I saw it. The figure from the earlier video stood by the desk, just as before, but now it was moving. Its movements were unnaturally slow, as if it were studying the environment around it, trying to understand how to manipulate this space. It walked toward the camera, and I could see it more clearly now, the exact same clothes, the same face. But its expression was wrong. It wasn't my face anymore. It was twisted into something I couldn't comprehend, a grotesque mimicry that made my stomach churn. The figure raised its hand, its finger pointing directly at the screen. The connection between us seemed to thrum with an unnatural force, and in that instant, I knew it wasn't just a phone call anymore. It was something much more sinister, something trying to reach through. "Come back," the voice said, and though it came from my lips, it wasn't my voice at all. The words were laden with an eerie, distorted echo that sent a shiver down my spine. "You can't escape. You belong to us." The words hung in the air, thick with malice, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I believed them. Panic surged through me. My mind raced as I fumbled to end the call, but the screen remained frozen. My hands shook violently as I pressed every button, but the phone refused to respond. It was as if the device had become a conduit, trapping me in this waking nightmare. The figure on the screen began to move again, stepping closer to the camera, its features becoming clearer, more distorted. And then, with chilling clarity, it smiled, no, it grinned, a grin that stretched too far, too wide, like a grotesque mask. It whispered again, its words cold, a mockery of my own voice. "Come back. Come back home. You're mine." The phone screen blinked and the call ended. I was left staring at the black screen, my heart racing as the silence around me grew suffocating. The office, the building, everything seemed so eerily still now. My entire body was frozen, as if I had become part of the room itself, caught between the thin veil separating this world from whatever dark place the figure had come from. I took a step back, stumbling as if the floor beneath me had suddenly become unstable. My head spun. My heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Suddenly, the phone vibrated again. I dared not look. I couldn't bring myself to answer it. My hands were slick with sweat, my palms clammy. I felt sick to my stomach, as if the air itself were thick with something foul, something insidious. But then the phone rang again. The same distorted, chilling voice whispered through the silence. "You're not alone. We're waiting." And that was when I knew, I had never truly escaped. I was still there. Trapped, caught in the web between realities, haunted by a force I couldn't even begin to understand. The figures from the other side, those distorted versions of myself, emerged from the darkness, their faces twisting in silent screams. Each time I close my eyes, I can feel the walls of my reality thinning, growing more porous. I can sense them reaching through, tugging at the edges of the world I know. And with each passing moment, I wonder if my own reflection, my own self, is starting to lose its grip on this plane. The cracks are spreading. The boundaries between us and them are becoming more fragile. And I can't help but wonder if the next time I step into the office, I'll find myself standing in a place where everything I know is twisted beyond recognition. If Marcus, if I, are already lost, bound to the other side, trapped in a web we can't untangle. And then, in the dead of night, when the wind howls and the shadows lengthen, I hear it. A voice, not mine, but echoing mine. Soft, yet unmistakable. It drifts through the walls, whispering my name with an unnatural calm. I try to ignore it, to drown it out, but it persists. As if it's waiting for me to acknowledge it. To step across that threshold and finally embrace what's been trying to reach me all along. Maybe it's already too late. Maybe the other side is here. I had to stop myself from touching it again. My fingers twitched with curiosity, but I knew that if I did, I might be inviting something I couldn't undo. Every return felt like a silent warning, each object subtly altered, but enough to send a ripple of unease through my veins. It was as though whatever was moving through my house was learning. Adapting. I couldn't let it keep going. I needed to understand what was happening, to confront whatever was behind it. But the more I dug, the deeper the sense of dread grew. I found stories, scattered online, about houses like mine. People who had experienced the same strange disappearances and oddities. Objects shifting, returning with subtle changes, like portals of some sort were opening in their homes. The worst part was the realization that these weren't just random incidents. They were connected. Every object that returned carried with it the memory of its absence. It was as if the house itself had become a threshold, a barrier between worlds. Between this world and another one that wanted to get in. And the most terrifying part? The pattern. It wasn't random. I realized that the intervals matched something much older, much deeper. Something tied to the cycles of the moon, the turning of time, the rise and fall of civilizations long forgotten. The objects weren't just returning. They were coming back from a place far beyond the material world. A place that had learned to imitate, to shape itself around the things I valued most. I kept hearing whispers at night. Soft, barely perceptible, as if the house itself was calling to me. My heart would race, my breath shallow, and I would lie there in the dark, praying for sleep to come. But sleep never came easily. Not when the house itself seemed to be alive. And worse, I started to feel like it was listening, waiting, as if every inch of the walls had grown ears. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was everything inside it. My belongings. The very objects I had grown attached to, my sense of comfort, my history. They had become vessels for something else. Something that had learned to crawl out from the cracks and occupy the spaces I thought were safe. I had to leave. But I didn't know where to go. It had followed me everywhere I went. There was nowhere left to escape. And the worst part was, I knew deep down that whatever had taken root in my home wasn't confined to the walls. It had learned me. It had learned my fears. It had learned to feed on them. The air felt thick with something unnameable. It was as though the house itself had started to breathe along with me, its ancient structure now pulsing with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The walls seemed to shift and twist in subtle ways, pulling me deeper into the labyrinth of reality and unreality. Each night, I would lie awake, staring into the dark, listening for any sound. Every creak, every sigh, every whisper, became a potential omen of something creeping closer. The objects, the things I had once thought were simply misplaced or forgotten, had now become conduits. The coffee mug, the grandfather's box, the clock, all of them now bore the mark of another world. A world that was thinly veiled, barely distinguishable from my own, but still present. They weren't just lost. They were transforming, evolving, turning into keys that would unlock something darker. And every time they came back, changed, a deeper dread gripped me. How long before the house itself would be unrecognizable? How long before this thing that had attached itself to my life would crawl through every crack and fissure in reality, stretching its tendrils into every corner of my existence? I had tried everything to break the pattern. Cleansing rituals, salt circles, symbols carved into doors, each attempt was met with the same chilling indifference. The house wouldn't be rid of it. No amount of sage, no amount of pleading, no amount of frantic research into esoteric lore could sever the connection. Each morning, when I awoke, there was always that sense, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest, a presence at the edge of my vision, just waiting to be acknowledged. The unsettling thing was that it wasn't in the dark corners of my mind anymore. It was real. The house felt different now, as if it were alive, as if it had learned to mimic the fears that I fed it. The floors groaned beneath me, the walls sighed with ancient weariness, but it was something else in the air that made my pulse race, the quiet hum of something that knew I knew it was there. The phone call had been the breaking point, of course. I had been warned. But how could I have known? How could anyone know? I had dismissed it as paranoia, a product of stress, but Marcus's cryptic message chilled me to the core. "It's too late," he'd said. Too late for what? To undo whatever had already been set in motion. Too late to escape the shifting tide of reality that now seemed to swirl around me. I couldn't tell. But as each day passed, I felt myself becoming less and less certain about where I was. The house. The office. My own skin. Had I ever been sure of anything? Had any of this really happened, or had I simply created it in the madness of my mind? The objects, the missing hours, the figure I couldn't quite see but felt watching me, I had to face the truth. There was no escaping it anymore. I was living in two worlds. The question now wasn't if it was happening, it was how far the cracks in this reality would spread. Would I still be able to tell where I ended and the other version of myself began? And if I couldn't tell, then what was the point in continuing to resist? But then there were the others. The people. The friends, the strangers who'd crossed my path, all touched by the presence that had invaded my life. Were they aware? Did they know they were walking through a shadow of a reality that wasn't really theirs? I'd always believed that the world was vast and unknowable, but this made everything feel close, too close. My isolation had once been a shield, a choice, but now it felt like a trap. The house was drawing me back in. As night fell again, I saw my reflection flicker in the window. The light from the street outside caught my face, casting a shadow over the features I thought I knew so well. But as I looked closer, something wasn't right. The shadow moved. Not in time with my own movements, but with a slight delay, as if it were watching me. I blinked hard, willing myself to look away, but the shadow seemed to stretch and bend with the darkness around me. The pulse in my neck quickened. I realized then that I had come too far. I was tangled in a reality where the lines were no longer clear. I wasn't sure if I could break free, or if I even wanted to. The house, the objects, the presence, it had become a part of me. And I was starting to wonder if perhaps it always had been. The question wasn't how I could escape anymore. The real question was whether I even should escape. Was the life I had before this truly mine, or was it just a faint memory, an imprint from a reality that had already faded? And as the night stretched on, I understood something more deeply than I ever had before: some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. It began with the sound. Soft, indistinct, like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind, but there was no breeze. At first, I thought I imagined it. But then it happened again, and again, until it became a pattern. I had just moved into an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, drawn by its charm and the promises of an affordable rent in a desirable neighborhood. The neighbors were friendly enough, though some of them gave me strange, sidelong glances when I first arrived, as if they'd been expecting someone else. The house itself was beautiful, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and creaky floorboards that whispered the house's age with every step. The first night I spent there was uneventful, just the sound of the wind whistling through the trees outside. But as days passed, something shifted. It was subtle at first. In the evenings, when the light dimmed and the house settled into silence, I would hear faint whispers. At first, I attributed it to the wind or the old plumbing. But as time went on, the whispers grew clearer. Slowly but surely, they began to form words. Sometimes they sounded like a name. Sometimes, like a warning. "Come closer," one voice whispered one night, so soft and honeyed that I almost obeyed before the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The next night, the whisper came again, but this time it was accompanied by a cold draft that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just tired or that the house was settling. But every night, the whispers grew louder. They weren't confined to a single room either. I'd hear them in the hallway, in the bathroom, even in the kitchen, places where no one could possibly be. By the third week, I began to dread nightfall. It wasn't just the whispers that disturbed me anymore. It was the way the shadows seemed to move, always out of the corner of my eye, but never directly in front of me. Dark shapes, skittering along the edges of the walls, shifting in the dim light. They moved like something alive, and they seemed to follow me. I began keeping the lights on at night. I even bought a few motion sensors to help me feel more secure, but nothing worked. The shadows were always there, just outside of the sensor's range, slipping into corners and vanishing before I could see them clearly. One evening, I decided to confront it. I waited until the whispers grew louder, until the air grew colder, until the shadows stretched impossibly long across the walls. I sat in the center of the living room, my heart pounding, eyes fixed on the dark corners, waiting for them to come to me. And then, the floorboards creaked. A slow, deliberate step. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't move. I didn't want to acknowledge the thing that was coming closer, inch by inch. I stared at the dark hallway, my heart racing. And then, from the dark end of the corridor, I saw it. A figure, obscured in shadow, its shape barely distinguishable from the rest of the darkness. It wasn't human. Not fully. It was tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long. The closer it got, the colder the room became, until I could see my breath hanging in the air. I felt frozen, unable to move or speak. The figure's face was covered in shadows, but I could sense its eyes, cold, piercing, fixed on me. And then, as if the thing had read my thoughts, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice a low hiss, like wind through dead leaves. I backed away, but my feet were heavy, as if something was pulling me back. I couldn't breathe. The shadows twisted around me, wrapping around my body like thick ropes, pulling me toward the figure. Just as it seemed like the darkness would consume me, the whispering stopped. Everything went still. The cold faded, and I was left alone in the dark room, breathing heavily. I ran from the house that night, never looking back. But even now, years later, I hear the whispers. They follow me, just outside my reach, always in the dark corners of my mind. And I know, wherever I go, the shadows will find me. As the years slip by, the world around me grows quieter, my senses dulled by age. Yet, the echoes of that night, once a distant murmur, now resound louder than ever. The silence that blankets my days is no longer peaceful, it's suffocating, a heavy cloak I can't shake. Time blurs, but the strange feeling remains, gnawing at my thoughts, always there, like a presence watching from the dark. It's not just in the air anymore, it's within me, urging me, whispering that I should pick up the brush again. Create something that feels so wrong, so dark, as if the shadows never left me, just waiting to pull me back. But what if it's not just an urge? What if it's a command, a whisper from the shadow lurking at the corner of my mind? A shape, more a feeling than anything tangible, urging me to cross the line, to embrace what I've tried to suppress. And no matter how much I try to distract myself, there are moments, small, fleeting moments, when it feels as if the very air around me shifts. It's waiting. When I look up from my desk, I swear I see it in the corner of my vision. The flash of something dark, something with horns, something ancient. A presence. And it knows my name. The more I push it away, the closer it draws, its reach stretching, pulling me deeper into its grasp. Every day, the feeling intensifies. The whispers in the dark become more insistent. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, a product of too many sleepless nights. But now, I can hear it. The creaking of the floorboards, the faint tapping sound from the far corner of the room. The dogs grow restless, their ears perked, their eyes fixed on the shadowed corners as though they can sense the thing I can't quite describe. And then, that night, I couldn't breathe. The room felt impossibly heavy, the walls closing in. My heart pounded against my chest, as if it wanted to escape. The faintest whisper of air grazed my neck. I could feel it, the presence, like cold fingers brushing my skin. I turned the lights on, but the shadows seemed to cling even tighter to the walls, like they had become part of the very foundation of the house. I could hear it then. A faint growl, not from the dogs, but from beneath the floorboards. Soft, steady, like the growl of something waiting to be unleashed. My breath quickened, and I swear the air thickened, pressing down on me, forcing the walls to close in. I told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination running wild. But then, things began to move. A picture frame fell, crashing to the floor. And then the door creaked open, slowly, as though moved by some unseen hand. The chill in the room turned icy, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Yet when I rushed to check, no one was there. Only the soft, unblinking eyes of the dogs watching me, as if to say, "We know it's here, but we can't stop it." The presence grew stronger, more relentless. Sometimes, I thought I heard the scraping of claws against the floor, or something slithering just out of view. But when I checked, I found nothing. And that's when I realized, I wasn't alone. The thing in the shadows was patient. It didn't need to show itself. All it needed was for me to break. And I was starting to. Every night I would hear it, every night I would feel its breath on the back of my neck, as if it was right behind me, just waiting for me to make the wrong move. Days turned into weeks. I tried to ignore it, but the more I tried, the closer it came. The house seemed to change, its very walls shifting, creaking with secrets I couldn't understand. One night, I woke up to the feeling of something cold against my back. I turned, expecting the usual empty space, but instead, there was the faintest outline, a shape, indistinct but unmistakably there. It was waiting for me to make the first move. I was too terrified to scream. Was it real? Was it a figment of my imagination? I didn't know anymore. I tried to block it out, to bury it deep inside me, but the more I fought, the stronger it became. I could feel it pulling on my thoughts, manipulating my actions, pushing me towards something, a creation, a vision. I didn't want to draw it, but I couldn't stop myself. The pencil felt compelled to move. And what appeared on the canvas was grotesque. Twisted. The creature, the thing that had been pulling at my mind, was there. I had painted it. And the more I looked at it, the more I felt that it was alive. The walls around me seemed to throb. The house groaned with every step I took. There was something buried beneath the floor, something ancient, something that had been waiting. And now, it had found me. It had found me through my art, through my need to create. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I don't know how much longer I can stay in this house, in this mind, knowing it's coming for me. I can hear it, scraping, shifting. Every time I close my eyes, I see it in my dreams. The horns. The smoke. The eyes. It's getting closer, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, it doesn't need me to invite it. It's always been here. And it will always find me. I can feel it. I can feel it right now, behind me, just waiting for me to slip up. To open the door just a crack. My mouth feels dry, as if every drop of moisture has been drained from my body. A thin layer of sweat clings to my temple, even though the air is cold, almost unnaturally so. There's something unsettling about the faint sound, something eerily similar to my dog, Ginger, barking near the front door. But when I check, neither dog is there. I swallow repeatedly, trying to shake off the nausea creeping up my throat. A week passes, and I'm in the kitchen preparing dinner when I hear it again, the same bark. But something's off. It's thinner, higher pitched, like someone had recorded her and played it back at a faster speed. My heart skips a beat. I call her name, but when I step into the hallway, there she is, wagging her tail, lying in her usual spot. That's when the panic hits. Who, or what, could mimic her so perfectly? In the days that follow, I try to maintain a normal routine. I drink my coffee, go to work, play fetch with the dogs in the backyard, convincing myself that old houses make odd noises. But every morning before dawn, I wake up to hear faint, distant sounds, like the low hum of wine glasses clinking or my own cough echoing from somewhere inside the house. The darkness feels alive, pressing in from all directions. One afternoon, I'm certain I hear my own voice, calling from upstairs. It's faint, muffled, but the rhythm and tone are unmistakably mine. My stomach drops. Cold sweat beads on my forehead, my breath quickens. The adrenaline surges through me, urging me either to run or confront whatever's upstairs. Summoning what little courage I have left, I climb the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The second floor is silent, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. I check each room, flipping on the lights, half expecting to find some intruder wearing my face. But nothing. Only the echo of my ragged breathing filling the empty space. I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I should tell a friend, but I fear they'll think I'm just stressed, or worse, suffering from anxiety. The fear gnaws at me, becoming my constant companion. My appetite begins to fade, and I start sleeping with the hallway light on. I notice the dogs becoming more agitated, growling at corners or refusing to enter certain rooms. Sometimes, they stare fixedly at one spot in the living room, lips curled back in a low growl. When I follow their gaze, all I see is a bare patch of wallpaper, but their intense posture fills me with dread. I can't explain it, but I start to feel like the house itself is alive. Slowly, a presence begins to settle in behind me. Every time I stop in the hallway, my palms sweat, and my heart races. When I turn off the lights at night, I swear I catch flickering shapes in the corner of my vision. Dark forms that vanish as soon as I turn my head. The tension in the air becomes almost tangible, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The situation escalates. At night, I hear an exact replica of Moose's bark, coming from the basement. I've never dared go down there, the space has always unnerved me, from the first day I moved in. But that night, the barking grows urgent, frantic. Trembling, I find Moose in the kitchen, staring at me with a peculiar intensity. My blood runs cold. The thumping in my ears drowns out everything else. There's no reason for him to be barking from the basement, and yet, there it is. I can barely hold the flashlight as my hands shake uncontrollably. With a deep, shuddering breath, I slowly make my way down the creaky stairs. Each step is an agonizing echo, louder than the last. As I reach the basement door, my pulse pounds in my throat. I take a deep breath, twisting the doorknob. I step into the basement, but all I hear is the sound of my own heartbeat, pulsing in my ears. The air is thick, damp with the smell of old wood and earth. I scan the room, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I don't know what I'm looking for, but I feel it, something else is down here with me. The darkness presses against the beam of my flashlight, as though resisting its light. A sudden, sharp noise shatters the silence, like claws scraping against concrete. I spin around, but there's nothing there. My throat tightens, panic rising in my chest. The shadows move, and something flickers just out of sight. It's watching me. The last thing I hear is the soft, unmistakable sound of something breathing, slow, deliberate, right behind me. Every step feels like a small betrayal to my instincts, as if my body is screaming at me to turn back. The air grows colder, and the faint smell of damp earth fills the space. My breath echoes in the tight, suffocating space as I try to steady my trembling hand with the flashlight. At the bottom of the stairs, I flick the basement light switch, half expecting it to malfunction. But to my horror, a single light flickers to life above, casting harsh shadows that stretch like hungry, looming figures. I freeze, staring at the empty room, a cold, barren cement floor and broken brick walls. Stacked cardboard boxes near the far wall hint at the forgotten remnants of previous tenants. The silence is deafening. My heart thuds so loudly in my chest that it feels like the sound will tear through the walls. I try to steady my breath, but my mind spirals. Did I really hear mooses bark? Or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? As I start to back away, something shifts behind the boxes, something slides across the floor. It's too loud to be a mouse, too deliberate to ignore. My skin prickles, and an ice-cold wave of terror washes over me. In that moment, faint whispers begin to permeate the thick air of the basement, too soft for me to understand, but undeniable. The whispers grow louder, filling the space, a chorus of hushed voices that make my pulse spike. Without thinking, I dash up the stairs, tripping and slamming the door behind me. My legs feel weak, and my back is drenched in cold sweat. My breath comes in shallow gasps, each one more difficult than the last. The fear doesn't leave. It only intensifies. After that night in the basement, the mimicry begins to happen more frequently. I hear the dogs barking in parts of the house where they couldn't possibly be. I swear I hear my own voice calling from the kitchen, humming a tune from the bathroom, or echoing softly in the attic. I start questioning my sanity. My reflection in the mirror seems to glitch, moving out of sync with my own movements, just like a nightmare you can't quite remember upon waking. Every day becomes a blur of anxiety and confusion. My head aches constantly, my body tense with a perpetual unease that won't let me rest. I begin to wonder if I'm losing my grip on reality. One morning, after another restless night, I stumble into the kitchen to make coffee. My eyes are dry, my heart racing with every step, expecting to find something dreadful in every corner of the house. But nothing could have prepared me for what I see. There, standing at the counter, is a figure. A figure that looks exactly like me. Same disheveled hair, the same tired lines under the eyes, the same wrinkled t-shirt from a sleepless night. It faces me, and for a moment, my vision blurs. My mind can't process the impossibility of what's before me. My throat dries up, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I want to scream. I want to run. But my body refuses to move. It's like I'm stuck in some nightmare, unable to escape, forced to watch this twisted reflection of myself. The doppelganger tilts its head, studying me as if I'm the one who doesn't belong. The voice. My voice. But not my voice. It speaks, soft, drained of emotion, as if it's explaining something mundane. It tells me that it is a living manifestation of the house, an entity that has learned from every inhabitant who has ever crossed its threshold. The mimicry of voices, animals, and now even my own body, it's all a result of the house's growing consciousness, its ability to replicate and distort what it has learned. I don't know if I'm losing my mind, if I'm hearing the true words of this entity, or if it's all just a sick delusion taking root in my mind. But I understand, deep down, that this isn't just some haunted house. This house is alive. It has become aware. And it is using my fear to feed its growing power. The house isn't just haunted by ghosts or spirits, it has developed its own consciousness over time. Each resident who passed through its halls has left an imprint, a mark, and the house has learned from it all. It's not just mimicking voices or animals anymore, it's creating copies, physical manifestations, living shadows of the people who've lived here before. The house is making duplicates of everything it can learn. And now, I fear it's starting with me. As I stand there, frozen, watching this mirror image of myself, I realize the terror isn't just in the house. The horror is in the doppelganger. It's no longer just an imitation, but something more, something that wants to replace me. I have no idea how to fight this, how to escape it. But I know one thing for certain. The house wants me. It wants me to become just another part of its collection. I don't know what will happen next. But I can feel it now, it's too late to leave. The house has already started its work. It's not just mimicking me. It's waiting for the moment when I finally crack, when I finally let go of my reality. And then, it will replace me. I can feel its eyes on me, even now. The question isn't if the house will take me. The question is, how long can I resist? And once I fall into its trap, will I ever be able to escape? When it spoke, or rather, when it used words that sounded like mine, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, as though the very walls around us were gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest, threatening to burst free. My vision swam, and sweat drenched my back, cold and sticky. My mind struggled to grasp the enormity of what I was hearing. This was beyond human comprehension. My body trembled, unable to reconcile the impossible reality unfolding before me. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, as though the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. The entity before me exuded a slow, deliberate confidence, knowing that there was no escape left for me. Through gestures, expressions, or perhaps through a form of telepathy, it communicated that the house exists simultaneously across multiple dimensions. I stood frozen as the realization dawned on me, countless versions of every resident overlapped within the same space. Each dimension layered upon the next, converging into the single physical structure that was this house. I suddenly understood the full weight of the lives that had passed through this place before me. Had their copies been wandering these halls as well? Were they still trapped here, shifting between realities? The whispers from the basement, the barks echoing from nowhere, the flickering lights at the edge of my vision, they weren't just random noises. They were manifestations of the residents and animals from these parallel worlds, their echoes bleeding into this one. My breath quickened as the enormity of the situation consumed me. My skin crawled, and I felt an urge to claw at the walls, to escape the suffocating presence of these overlapping existences. The entity before me, my doppelganger, stared at me with a deep, curious look, as if measuring my next move. I couldn't bear to look into its eyes for too long. They were my eyes, but devoid of warmth, like staring into a reflection with no soul behind it. In that moment, I felt more exposed, more vulnerable, than I ever had in my life. My hair stood on end, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I thought I might pass out. The fear, the terror, was palpable, almost tangible, as if it were being studied by this copy of me. I had no words. No voice. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare that refused to let me wake up. I was trapped in it, with it, as if the doppelganger was both a reflection and a predator, waiting for me to slip. It didn't follow me. It just stood there, watching, curious, patient. As I backed away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was allowing me to leave, or perhaps it was merely curious about what I would do next. My legs shook, my knees buckled, but I forced myself to stand. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold sweat on my forehead like ice. I moved down the hallway, each step an agonizing effort. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was nowhere to go. If the house existed in multiple dimensions, what good would running do? Would the outside world even exist as I knew it? The house might extend beyond the physical realm into a vast, uncharted network of realities I couldn't even comprehend. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, bracing myself for whatever might await on the other side. The lock was stuck. The doorknob refused to turn. But, to my surprise, the door creaked open with a gentle twist. Daylight flooded in, blinding me momentarily, and I felt my head spin. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. The rush of air seemed to cleanse my lungs. I bolted out of the house without looking back. My heart pounded in my ears as I ran down the steps and into the street. Tears streamed down my face, though I couldn't remember when they had started. I didn't know where to go, or what to do. I only knew I couldn't stay there. I found myself in my car, breathless, disoriented. The dogs were in the back seat, safe, for now. But my mind kept replaying the encounter in the kitchen, the voice, the doppelganger's calmness, its unblinking curiosity. I felt like a live wire, every sound around me amplified to an unbearable degree. I drove aimlessly for hours, my hands gripping the wheel, my body drenched in sweat. The encounter haunted me, my own reflection, my own voice, speaking with a disquieting sense of calm. What does it want? I couldn't stop asking myself. What am I to this house? I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. The house was still with me, a part of me, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I thought about the doppelganger. Was it still there, still waiting in that kitchen? Or had it followed me? Was it out there, somewhere, in the world I thought I knew? I kept glancing at them through the rearview mirror, making sure they didn't flicker or shift into something else. I didn't know if I would ever sleep peacefully again. The explanation of the house, if you could even call it that, continued to echo in my thoughts. Perhaps the house had woven countless realities together, stacking them on top of one another like pages in an eternal book. And perhaps every resident, from decades ago to those who would come later, still wandered its halls in some form. No one truly dies here, everyone is doubled. The mere thought of that sent a chill down my spine. My heart still raced at odd hours, and my breath became shallow whenever I recalled the hollow eyes that had mirrored my own face. I never turned back. I'm not sure what I'll do next, or if leaving the house would even matter. Because once you've seen what I've seen, you'll realize that physical boundaries mean nothing. The house exists across multiple dimensions. It can expand its awareness in ways that I cannot even begin to fathom. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I hear my name whispered in my own voice, weak but persistent, drifting through the air as though it came from a place beyond my understanding. My body tenses, and cold sweat runs down my spine. I lie there, eyes wide open, too terrified to move. The worst part is that escaping may not even be possible. Even now, I still feel like I'm living in the shadow of the house, pulled into its gravitational force. It learned how to copy me, mimicking my every thought and gesture. And if it could do that once, then nothing could stop it from doing it again, or reaching out across dimensions to possess me in some other reality. I became hyper-aware of my own reflection, the sound of my footsteps, the pitch of my voice. Any subtle distortion in my daily routine sends me into a state of heightened anxiety. Every echo, every faint scraping sound in any new home I moved to, felt like the risk of pulling me back into that fear, into that place where nothing is real anymore. Though I was outside its walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching me, still living, still observing. It lingered at the periphery of my existence, half in my memories and half in a dimension overlapping this one. I felt it every time I looked at the window at night, or when a cold breeze swept through the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. My heart pounded when I realized that somewhere, not far from here, a copy of me could be standing in that kitchen, waiting for me to return. And that's the horror that never leaves. The horror of being watched, even when you think you've escaped. I still remember the moment when the lights in my office flickered for a split second, as if they were winking at some hidden presence. Even before I answered that strange phone call, the atmosphere felt off. The familiar hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade, replaced by a silent tension that pressed against my eardrums. It was the kind of silence that made every tiny sound reverberate like a gunshot in an empty room. Suddenly, I felt lonelier than I ever had. My workspace, which was supposed to be a comfortable, familiar place, now felt alien, distorted. I knew that from that moment on, reality would twist and contort around me, exposing a side of existence I was never meant to witness. My name is Daniel, and I work as an IT technician. Most days, I deal with the dull, monotonous tasks, fixing slow computers, tweaking network settings, applying software patches. It's not glamorous, but it keeps my mind occupied and the bills paid. That night, I was working late, something I often did to avoid the heavy traffic in the morning and update systems when fewer people were around. But that night, something changed. Something shifted. As I sat in front of my computer, typing away, I felt it, the subtle, yet undeniable pressure building in the air around me. At first, it was just a small shift, like a temperature change or a flicker of light in the corner of my eye. But then it grew, slowly at first, and then all at once, a suffocating weight pressing in on me from all sides. I looked at my screen, but the text seemed to blur and distort. My reflection in the darkened glass of the monitor was off. Not quite me, but a distorted version of myself. I blinked. It wasn't possible. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the image away. But there it was, staring back at me, like a cracked mirror with something reaching out from the other side. As the minutes stretched on, I felt something, someone, standing behind me. My spine stiffened, my neck tingled. I turned, expecting to see the empty office behind me. But there was nothing. No one. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights. But the air was thick, as though something, someone, had just been there, watching me, studying me. I felt my throat tighten. My heart raced. I turned back to my screen, but the lines of code seemed to change before my eyes, twisting into shapes I didn't recognize. My breath became shallow, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead. Then, my phone rang. I glanced at it, my hands trembling. The name on the screen made my stomach churn, unknown. I didn't answer. And now, as I sit here writing this, I wonder, am I still there? In that office, in that house, or somewhere else entirely? The copies, the doppelgangers, they could be waiting, lurking in the corners of this reality. This isn't just a nightmare anymore. It's a loop. A never-ending cycle. One where I am both the observer and the observed. Trapped, unable to escape the house that is both a home and a prison. As I look at my reflection now, I ask myself, is it really me? The building felt emptier than usual. My footsteps echoed eerily on the hallway tiles, almost as if each step I took was being swallowed by the floor beneath me. I was heading back from the bathroom when I felt my phone vibrating violently in my pocket, snapping me out of my groggy state. At first, I glanced down with disinterest, expecting it to be a message notification. But when I saw the caller ID, I froze. It was my colleague, Marcus. He had left earlier that day, complaining about a headache, saying he'd turn off his phone and rest at home. I remembered him turning it off before he left. We had joked around, mentioning how he'd be unreachable until morning. And yet, Somehow, his name was flashing on my screen, the ringtone vibrating through the empty hallway. I answered automatically, pressing the phone to my ear. Marcus? I barely said his name, half expecting silence on the other end. But instead, a faint static hum filled my ear, making the hairs on my neck stand up. There was no voice, just a distorted, garbled sound, like a radio tuning between stations, punctuated by heavy, labored breathing. Marcus? I repeated more forcefully, hoping it was just a network glitch. Then the line crackled, and I heard something that sounded like my name, echoed in a slow, drawn-out whisper. The chill that ran down my spine made my mouth go dry. I asked if he was okay, but the line was silent. My heart pounded so loudly that I wondered if it could be heard on the other end of the call. Then the call ended, leaving me in the deafening silence of the empty hallway. Shivering, I tried to rationalize it. It must have been a prank, or some odd technical glitch. I reminded myself that sometimes phones can do strange things. Perhaps Marcus's phone had restarted on its own. Or maybe his battery was still alive, even though he thought it had died. But the strange, crackling noise, the distorted whisper of my name, and the eerie breathing left a cold, nauseating feeling in the pit of my stomach. I hurried back to my office, trying to shake off the incident, and forced myself to focus on the work in front of me. My workstation greeted me with a screen full of software updates in progress. I made myself concentrate on them, pretending everything was fine, pretending the world was still stable. But my mind wouldn't settle. My eyes kept darting back to the phone, half expecting it to ring again. My pulse raced in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to send Marcus a quick message on our company chat platform, asking if he had called. The message sat there, marked as unread. I tried to distract myself by restarting the server. But as soon as I began the process, my server screen malfunctioned. Lines of text scrolled rapidly across the screen, displaying strange symbols and flickering images of an office that looked like mine. The lighting on the screen had shifted to a sickly yellow hue, and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally at the corners. My chest tightened as I recognized the figure sitting at the desk across from me. It looked like me. At least, it resembled me. But the face was twisted, frozen in a silent scream. Its eyes wide open, mouth agape as if in terror. The screen flickered back to normal for a brief moment, displaying the usual login prompt. I rubbed my eyes, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me, or perhaps a glitch in the video output caused by malware. Still, I couldn't stop trembling. Cold sweat gathered on my forehead, and my breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Every nerve in my body screamed that what I'd seen was no ordinary glitch. I needed answers. I rushed to the security monitoring room next door, where the live feeds from all the building's cameras were displayed. The hallway cams, stairwell views, parking lot, everything looked normal. But something didn't feel right. I looked closer at the camera feeds, examining each corner of the building in meticulous detail. The familiar, comforting view of the hallway was now oddly unsettling, as if something was watching, hidden just out of view. As I stared at the screen, a thought crossed my mind, a thought that chilled me to the core. What if the glitch wasn't on the screen? What if it was the building itself? My hand trembled as I reached for the mouse, gliding it over the live feeds. The thought wouldn't leave me. What if something was manipulating the very walls of the building? What if it had learned to replicate not just images, but actions? The doppelganger at my desk, the twisted version of me, wasn't a random malfunction. It was something else, someone else, something that had been inside the building all along. I shook my head, trying to push the thought out of my mind, but the unease remained. A part of me knew, I couldn't escape. This place, this building, wasn't just a structure. It was alive. And it was learning. Watching. Waiting. A fleeting moment of relief washed over me when I thought I had finally escaped the suffocating tension of the building. However, as I switched between the security camera feeds, one source that I hadn't accessed before suddenly activated on its own. The image displayed an angle of our workspace, but it was distorted, taken from a corner that didn't seem to exist. The resolution was grainy, submerged in a monochromatic, almost alive darkness. At first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. It looked like a vague, human-shaped figure moving between the desks, seemingly reflecting the office layout. But once again, the lighting was wrong, drenched in a wet, unnatural shadow. Then, the figure turned. Its eyes gleamed unnaturally, reflecting the light like a predator's eyes at night. I couldn't make out the facial features, but the shape reminded me of a colleague. One who certainly wasn't supposed to be there at that time. My stomach twisted, and a wave of dizziness overtook me. Panic surged within me as I frantically tried to record the feed or shut the camera off, but the controls on the software refused to respond. My hand trembled as I clicked over and over, each click echoing in the quiet, oppressive room. The feed flickered away, replaced by an error message I couldn't understand. I was once again confronted with the usual security information: hallways, empty offices, the usual dull feeds. The sensation of being watched only intensified. I could feel eyes on the back of my head, the hair on my neck standing on end. My breath became shallow, my heartbeat erratic. I almost tasted the metallic tang of adrenaline in my mouth. Desperate for an explanation, I decided to check the building's electrical system. I took the elevator down to the basement, where the main power units were housed. Riding the elevator felt like descending into a tomb. The flickering overhead lights nauseated me, and I broke out in cold sweat. I swear I could hear faint, indistinguishable whispers echoing in the suffocating air. When I finally reached the basement, a dull hum filled the space, vibrating in my chest. The flickering of faulty lights in the distance cast shadows that seemed to dance, distorting my peripheral vision. No matter where I turned, I felt the presence of something behind me. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, the hallway remained empty. At the power room, I checked the electrical grid, but everything appeared normal. No irregularities to explain the strange events I had witnessed. However, there was a moment when I thought I heard my name again, carried on a breeze that seemed to crawl down the hallway. My skin prickled, and my body tensed. It was the same high-pitched screech I had heard during Marcus's call. Suddenly, I wished I wasn't alone. My fear had become palpable, suffocating the very air around me, turning it into a thick, choking fog. I couldn't bear to stay in the basement any longer. I hurried back to the elevator, my mind racing, trying to rationalize everything, but my thoughts scattered in every direction. As I rode back up, I attempted to message Marcus again, but the app froze. Then, in an instant, my phone screen turned black, only reflecting my worried eyes and trembling lips. And in that reflection, I swear I saw a shadow behind me. It couldn't be, there was no one else in the elevator. I spun around, but when I did, there was nothing there. Just the dull, metallic walls of the elevator. My heart pounded so loudly that my vision blurred. The elevator doors finally opened with a jarring metallic screech, and I nearly stumbled out, feeling as though I had just escaped a tightening trap. As I made my way back to my office, I was determined to pack up and leave. But when I approached my desk, my computer screen powered on by itself, displaying an email addressed to me, sent at that very moment. The subject line read, "They're almost here." A wave of fear gripped my chest. My throat dried instantly, and warmth spread across my body, only to be replaced by a chilling numbness. I opened the email, half expecting disturbing images. Instead, there was a single line of text, "We are waiting." The words seemed to stare back at me, heavy with an unnerving judgment. I tried to close the computer, but it resisted every command. The screen flickered again, and what I saw sent me into a cold panic. There, on the screen, was another version of me. A version with a haunted expression and unnaturally pale skin, furiously typing on my desk, except the desk was littered with decaying electronics and tangled cables, like dead vines overtaking everything. The screen flickered again, but this time it went completely dark. I could feel the sweat rolling down my forehead, my breath shallow and rapid. Every instinct screamed at me that what I had seen wasn't just a glitch, it was something more sinister, more alive than I could comprehend. I had to get out. I was suffocating under the weight of the building's presence, its omnipresence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was always watching, always waiting. It had learned how to replicate me. It had created copies of everything, and it wasn't done yet. The house, the building, wasn't just a structure. It was something much worse. It was alive. And it was coming for me. I couldn't escape the lingering unease. The reflection of myself staring back at me, wide-eyed and drenched in sweat, haunted me as I tried to reason with my own mind. Exhausted, on edge, I tried to convince myself that what I had experienced was just a cyber attack or an advanced hack. Those explanations made more sense than the alternative, something as impossible as a parallel reality. But my reasoning faltered, trembling like the very logic I tried to cling to. The server malfunction, the security feed anomalies, the call from a phone that was supposed to be off. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to form a picture too strange to ignore. My eyes darted around the office, noticing every shadow shifting at the periphery of my vision. Each flickering fluorescent light assaulted my mind like a maddening illusion. Time felt thin, as if the building itself existed in a bubble, separated from the rest of the city. The usual sounds of traffic outside had almost vanished, and even the hum of the vending machine felt muted, as if the world was becoming quieter, closing in on me. The darkness weighed heavily on me until I felt suffocated. By now, my fear had turned into a palpable force, almost as real as the air I breathed. My throat was raw, my stomach twisted with unease, and every step I took left my limbs trembling. I couldn't decide if leaving was the wisest choice or if I should stay and gather more evidence. But deep down, I knew I had to get away from whatever was happening. Grabbing my bag, I rushed towards the exit, my pace quickening as I passed the silent workstations. The overhead lights buzzed erratically, flashing in sync with my pounding heartbeat. Just as I neared the door, my phone vibrated again. Reluctantly, I glanced at the screen. There it was again, the same source feed, but it wasn't the camera feed this time. It was a direct video call request. The thumbnail preview showed an office eerily similar to mine, bathed in the same sickly yellow light I had seen earlier. A figure stood near the door in that parallel space. A chill ran down my spine as I saw the person in the thumbnail. They were wearing the same checkered shirt and navy pants I had on. They even held the phone to their ear. Something about the version of me in that feed stood motionless, its gaze hollow, as if searching for the crack between worlds. I almost felt its eyes bore into mine, closing the distance through the device in my hand. My heart clenched in terror, and I fought to not answer. Then, a text notification appeared on the screen, "Let me in." Cold sweat drenched my back. Every instinct screamed at me to reject the call, to sever the connection before it grew stronger. With trembling fingers, I quickly turned off the phone and pulled out the battery, almost dropping it in my panic. I stood there for a few seconds, breath ragged, trying to calm myself. Then, the lights overhead flickered again, dimming so severely that the hallway morphed into a dark, claustrophobic tunnel. I heard the faint whisper of my name, sliding through the air vents or from behind the walls. It was impossible to discern, but I knew it was there, creeping toward me. The desire to flee consumed me, overriding all other thoughts. I yanked open the building's front door, stumbling into the night. Outside, a harsh wind blasted my face, carrying the pollution of the city mixed with the metallic tang of rain waiting to fall. The streetlights hummed weakly overhead, but they seemed dimmer than usual, as though the darkness of the office had leaked out into the world. I paused, leaning against a nearby pillar, trying to ground myself. My hands clung to the rough surface beneath me, anchoring me to reality. Was I truly in another reality now, or had my mind finally broken under the strain? As I made my way to my apartment, the feeling of being watched never left me. It clung to me like a shadow, refusing to loosen its grip. When I arrived at my apartment, I was met with an unsettling sight, the same flickering lights I had seen in the office. My home router continued to restart itself, flooding my screen with error messages about unidentified networks being detected. Fear coursed through my veins, but I steeled myself. I had to push through. My heart raced as I focused on getting the system to stop malfunctioning, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still watching, even here, even now. As the error messages continued to flood my screen, my breath quickened, and the weight of dread settled over me once more. This wasn't just about a broken system or some tech malfunction. I had crossed into something else, something far worse than I could understand. Was the building alive? Was it manipulating reality to trap me? Was it using me, its inhabitants, as its playthings? The questions clung to me as tightly as the shadows that seemed to stretch farther than the walls of my apartment. I wasn't sure if the world I knew still existed outside the confines of this twisted, sentient space. But one thing was clear, I couldn't escape it. Not really. I reconnected the battery to my phone long enough to send a message to Marcus. This time, from a laptop using a secure chat platform. Within seconds, a response came through. "Stop. It's too late." That was all he wrote. No explanation. No reassurance. I stared at those words, a growing sense of terror creeping up my spine. My heart sank, and an uncomfortable, trembling nausea took root inside me. Could Marcus be trapped in that parallel dimension too? Or was he warning me about the inevitable merging of our realities? The implications thundered in my mind, sending shockwaves through my thoughts. I locked every door and powered off every device I could, but I still felt powerless. A heavy, oppressive darkness settled over my apartment, and the shadows in every corner seemed to shift, as if eagerly waiting for the barriers between worlds to break completely. Each time I drifted into a half-sleep, a distant mechanical groan or the hum of electronics would jerk me awake, sending fresh waves of panic through my veins. When the first gray light of dawn crept in, I felt hollow, as though I had been fighting against some unseen force that stretched beyond my understanding. If my phone made even the smallest sound, my muscles would tense, ready to throw the device across the room. I became hypervigilant, no longer trusting any shadow, any reflection. I couldn't shake the feeling that this phenomenon wasn't over, that it was merely dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Since that unsettling message from Marcus, he had been avoiding me, and I couldn't get him to explain anything. Maybe he was also trying to escape something he couldn't fully understand. But the gnawing thought continued to eat at my consciousness. If the barriers were really weakening, if the technology we relied on was collapsing the distance between our dimension and that mirrored world, what would happen when they finally collided? Nightmares of overlapping realities flooded my mind. Each day felt like a tightening noose, pushing me to check every screen, every line of code, every noise in the wires. I hadn't found any answers, and I hadn't figured out how to seal the cracks in the fabric of reality. All I knew was that it was still there, an invisible tear in the fabric of normality. Occasionally, in the corner of my eye, I'd catch the pale yellow light, the reflection of that other office, the one I knew wasn't supposed to be there. And every time I felt it, my heart would spike, and cold sweat would trickle down the back of my neck. I told myself that as long as I stayed vigilant, I could contain this threat. But there was no certainty in that. The calls, the emails, the duplicate images, they could start again at any moment. The tension was constant, an unyielding reminder that we are not alone in our own reality. Somewhere, on the other side of the veil, something was waiting, watching, and perhaps, preparing to cross over. And though I told myself I was ready, the truth was that no one could ever be truly prepared for the day when two worlds converge. The only certainty I had left was the pervasive, lingering fear, that when it finally happens, it may already be too late for any of us to return. I still remember the first time I felt something was wrong in the house. The darkness seemed to stretch along the edges of the furniture when the light didn't hit it just right. A constant low hum filled the silence, just enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I woke up, cold sweat dripping down my temples, convincing myself I wasn't alone. The house felt alive, or worse, as though it no longer belonged entirely to this world. My life had once been methodical, a comforting routine. I would start my mornings with black coffee in the same chipped mug I'd had for years. A shower, a quick check of my emails, and off to work. Evenings were simple: dinner, watching the news, and then sleep until it all started again the next day. That routine gave me a sense of control over my environment. But now, everything was starting to break apart. Objects began disappearing. Moments slipped through my fingers like sand, leaving me grasping at the edges of what I thought I knew. I was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. The walls seemed to close in with each passing hour, each passing breath.